Hi everybody, my name is Dr. Marco N. Jones. I'm an assistant professor in Middle East Studies and Digital Humanities at Hamad bin Khalifa University in Doha. And today I'm going to tell a story. It's a story about disinformation. The reason I want to tell a story is because I want to actually take you through the process of a disinformation campaign, how we find it, and how it's increasingly important to see the Middle East as an exporter of disinformation that targets global audiences from the USA to Europe and Asia. So let's go back a few months. It's about May 2020. I receive a message on Twitter from a friend. He says, Mark, I just got this really strange message from a guy called Rafael Badani. And I said, oh, what did it say? And he said, well, he's asking me to join him in promoting essentially any article that's critical of Facebook's appointment of the Yemeni activist Tawakkol Karman. Now, as many of you know, Tawakkol Karman won the Nobel Peace Prize for her work, and she was later appointed to the Facebook Oversight Committee, which is a body that created by Facebook to help democratize, or at least try to democratize, the process of moderating content. And it was very strange because this message came on the back of a clear disinformation campaign on Twitter using bots and fake accounts, demonizing Tawakkol Karman, saying that her appointment would simply turn the Facebook into an outlet for the Muslim Brotherhood. And we had very strange hashtags trending like Facebook Caliphate or No to Tawakkol Karman. So the timing was very interesting that he should get this message. So I said, okay, well, you know, this guy, he messages you, ask him for a Zoom meeting. And let's remember, Rafael Badani, the guy who'd contacted him, he had a profile picture, a LinkedIn account. He'd clearly got some other articles out in well-known news media outlets like Newsmax, which was recently promoted by Donald Trump. But I said, you know what, just ask him for a Zoom meeting or something, you know. And so my friend, he contacted Rafael and said, yeah, let's talk about what you want. Let's have a Zoom meeting. And Rafael got back to him saying, no, I don't like to do Zoom meetings. I hope you understand. It's just an issue of privacy and security. This was a red flag initially. Why would someone who was happy to have their profile picture on Twitter be unwilling to engage in a Zoom meeting? And so I said, well, push him further, see what he actually wants from you. And so my friend then asked Rafael what he wanted. And then Rafael Badani came back with a link to an article in Asia Times. And the link was specifically about the appointment of Tawakkol Karman and why this was a bad thing. Okay, this was bizarre. So I got in touch with a friend from the Daily Beast, who's a good researcher, and we started looking into this. We started to find very strange things very quickly. Firstly, we found that Rafael Badani had stolen a picture from an American guy in California, and then he was using his profile photo as his own. So Rafael Badani was writing for this site called Persia Now and Arab Eye. Both news sites, both had very similar green and white branding. And when we looked into it further, we saw that these websites, which were ostensibly separate, shared the same Google Analytics code. So we started to look at the other journalists who had written for Arab Eye and Persia Now. I mean, we wrote up a list of about 30 different contributors who wrote articles for them. But before we get to that, we stayed more on Rafael Badani. What else had he written? Well, Badani was quite prolific. He had written for Newsmax. He'd written, I think, for the Washington Times. And he'd written numerous articles for Persia Now and Arab Eye. And when we looked into the other journalists, it was the same pattern. Many of these journalists who'd written for Arab Eye and Persia Now were also writing in other outlets, such as Spiked Online, Human Events, The Post Millennial, the Hill Times, Asia Times, South China Morning Post. These guys were a relatively young collection of journalists who'd established themselves by writing op-eds across the world in reputable outlets. The only catch is they didn't exist. They were all fake. And how do we know that? Well, we know for a number of reasons. Firstly, let's take Rafael. He was using a fake photo. He refused to appear on camera. So that article that Rafael had initially shared with my friend was in the Asia Times. I checked it out, and it was about Tawakkol Karman. The author was someone called Lynn Nguyen, a very generic name. She had a photo, she had biographical details in our article. They were quite vague, but she was described as someone who worked in the private sector and contributed in these cases to certain newspapers. But there was no other trace of her apart from these few articles in both the South China Morning Post and the Asia Times. There was nothing there. And then I went through a few search engines seeing if I could find her photo using a reverse image search. And surely enough, I eventually found it. And it didn't belong to someone called Lin Nguyen. It belonged to someone called Nu Tai, who had actually worked in Singapore. And the photo in question that Lin Nguyen was using had been taken from the website of this Singaporean firm. So we found another account that was also using a fake photo. And what they were doing, they were flipping the photos, right? So this made it harder to search for in a reverse image search. So you had to actually flip it yourself and then search for the flipped image in order to stand a chance of finding it. And what was very interesting again about this article written by Lin Nguyen, which was suspicious, was the fact it was very clear promoting this line that Tawakkul Karman's appointment was dangerous. It was dangerous because it was essentially promoting and raising the profile of the Muslim Brotherhood. And obviously for me, as a scholar of the region, this was suspicious because I know that, the anti-Muslim Brotherhood campaign is very much a foreign policy position of the United Arab Emirates and Saudi and Egypt and to a lesser extent Bahrain. So this to me was already very suspicious. We've got two things here. We've got Rafael Badani, who was using a fake photo. We've got Lin Nguyen, who was also using a fake photo. Rafael Badani and Lin had both written for numerous op-eds for multiple news organizations, but they appeared not, they didn't appear, they weren't who they claimed to be, right? So what we did, we went back to Arab Eye and Persian Now. We went through all the contributors systematically, see what they had written for what outlets, looked in their biographies, looked at their social media accounts to see more about them. What we discovered was quite incredible. They had written articles in over 46 different international news media outlets, from New Europe, Spiked, the Jerusalem Post, Asia Times, South China Morning Post, Human Events, the National Interest, Fair Observer, American Thinker, Japan Today. These guys had been prolific, right? And not prolific just in a local context, across the world. And they had written over 90 articles in these various different publications. So these guys had had a huge impact in terms of how they were able to get their message across. So the next step was to see, well, what were they writing? Was there some sort of editorial consistency across the different pieces that would suggest this was some sort of influence operation on behalf of a certain actor? And yes, there was. Actually, most of the articles reflected a hawkish policy towards Iran and the Middle East. In fact, the majority of the articles concerned Iran and Iranian influence around the rest of the Gulf region and the Middle East in general. And specifically, there was a number of articles praising the United Arab Emirates and also attacking Turkey and Qatar. So all these things together would suggest that they were reflective of Emirati foreign policy, or at least the foreign policy of the blockading countries. And so by using that analysis, we can kind of have an inferred attribution as to who might have been behind this campaign. And what's also very interesting was not only the relative sophistication of this campaign, the articles themselves that were written were very well polished, they were well produced, and they were well written. And they were in a way well argued, although they omitted they omitted certain facts or realities on the ground. But another thing that was really striking about this operation, it had been going on for a year, and in that time, the relative sophistication of the accounts had changed. The earlier accounts in the network that were created earlier usually stole people's Facebook photos or social media photos. This was the case for several of the accounts. However, the newer accounts actually used photos generated by artificial intelligence, generative adversarial networks. Now anyone can do this now. If you just go to thispersondoesnotexist.com, click refresh, artificial intelligence will generate a unique human face. And for the most part, these are very, very realistic, and they're only going to get more realistic. So this network of journalists was fooling people by actually using profile images generated by artificial intelligence. So this was something that was quite astounding in this operation. So what was the influence of these articles? Well, we don't know without asking the publications and asking to see their analytics, to see how many people shared, read, and distributed these articles. And of course, we definitely don't know of those who did read the articles who was actually influenced by them. But we do know, using OSINT methods, that we can look, for example, who shared those links on Twitter. We know that Ryan Fournier, head of Trump for Students, shared one of the articles. Nathalie Goulet, a French senator, she also shared one of these articles. So some people found these messages compelling enough to actually share them on. And these are influential people on Twitter, and of course in the real world too. I think one of the scary things about this operation, in addition to its capaciousness and its global reach, was actually the reactions. We talk about trying to tackle disinformation. They say charity starts at home, but tackling disinformation also starts at the editor's desk. And what was very interesting is when we published this piece, was to see how the different news outlets reacted to this whole scandal, right? I would summarize their responses as falling into sort of 4 categories, with varying levels of, I would say, journalistic integrity. One was to just take down the article and not say anything, right? The other was to take down the article and leave an editor's note saying that they had been targeted by an influence operation, which is presumably the best way to approach this. Then another common method was to leave the article up with an editor's note saying that, they had been fooled, but we're going to keep the article up for either transparency or other reasons. And the most, I think, surprising and outlandish response was actually keeping the article up and defending the fact that the article remained up. In the case of Human Events, and again, another sort of conservative US publication, the editors decided to keep it up because they agreed with the argumentation of the article. And they were less concerned by the fact that this was most likely a state influence operation. So they were literally publishing what was probably state propaganda, defending it simply because they agreed with it, which highlights a whole host of problems with how people might view the purpose of journalism. Not something that you just have to agree with, but something that might challenge your conceptions of a particular place. And of course, there were also news outlets that just left the article up without a comment, as if nothing had happened or as if they hadn't even heard about this news. And this was certainly the case of some of the English language Middle Eastern-based websites like Al Arabiya, the Saudi-based news channel, which just left the articles up without any sort of comment at all. And when we published the article, we also got responses from some editors who had been very vigilant or diligent when screening potential submissions by these fake journalists. A guy at the Hong Kong Free Press said he was approached several times by Lin Nguyen, the woman who had written for the Asia Times, pitching these op-eds, right? She was very insistent and polite, and the editor said that these op-eds were well crafted, very well written, very well polished, suggesting that whoever was doing this was actually a sophisticated, native level English speaker who probably had a very good understanding of regional politics and journalism. I think this is a really good example of an information operation from an actor or a bad actor, probably operating from the Middle East region, probably working on behalf of the United Arab Emirates, was attempting to target a global audience in order to spread its propaganda. And in particular, it was targeting right-wing US publications. So it was clear that what we were seeing was this desire to try and influence the American right for policies favorable to both the Emirates and the blockading countries. Now, this is obviously important for a number of reasons. We're reaching a point now where there is increasingly difficult to establish any sort of sovereignty over one's national information ecosystem. And we're seeing this constantly eroded. Obviously, everyone's familiar with the investigation into Russian manipulation in social media ahead of the US elections in 2016. But we're seeing this a lot coming from the Middle East to the US. I myself have documented on a number of occasions, for example, when Trump tweets something favorable to a certain country in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, his tweet is then artificially promoted by robotic accounts in order that the salience of that tweet is then increased. The same is true as when he's criticized Qatar before. When he said that Qatar was well known to support terrorism, that account was artificially boosted, giving the sense to whoever reads his tweets, and that's audiences all over the world, that that particular position is popular. And there's been research done on the fact that if things are perceived to be popular, people are more likely to agree with them, creating this kind of herd effect. We also, I mean, I've also been working on a study in which it seems that news organizations or journalists connected to Saudi Arabia or Saudi news channels are attempting to co-opt real Americans into spreading Saudi propaganda organically amongst right-wing networks online, in the hope that that will then be reproduced through the US ecosystem, and maybe even, for example, retweeted by Donald Trump, who, as we know, has often retweeted accounts with questionable provenance. These kind of campaigns, often we don't know who does them. Sometimes we have a good idea, because there are so many and there are so many potential players in the scene. We know, for example, recently, I've interviewed a number of journalists who've been exposed to horrendous trolling campaigns and forms of cyber harassment designed to intimidate them and get them to stop speaking on specific issues. We know that the State Department has itself funded the Iran Disinfo Project, which has been accused of intimidating American citizens because they haven't had a policy position or they haven't had an opinion that is sufficiently militaristic against Iran. And we know, for example, that the Iran Disinfo Project was also linked to the think tank, the American think tank Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. So this information ecosystem is a complex array of both, in some cases, government entities, think tanks, and actors that we do not know. In the case of the story that I narrated, we still don't know who necessarily was behind it. And this is the problem with disinformation. Often we don't know who the actors are, and we have to infer who they might be based on the disinformation that they are producing. So much of the disinformation in the region that's not necessarily going back into the US or European ecosystem is incredibly virulent. In Arabic, disinformation seems to thrive, and I think part of the reason for this is that there's a regulatory blind spot when it comes from the social media companies, who are less inclined to take action against accounts that aren't speaking in English or that aren't impacting directly on US interests. And this is very dangerous, because what this allows is a space where there are a lot of authoritarian regimes who are obviously used to clamping down on freedom of speech, using social media and platforms as tools of disinformation, but also tools of intimidation and harassment.
Well, Max, it's good to see you live from New York City. It's obviously been an eventful several days for all of us as Americans. And the question we're teed up to talk about today, or the set of issues, is one I know you've devoted a tremendous amount of focus and attention to as a member of Congress, and just as a matter of public policy. Of all the issues that congressmen can choose to kind of go after and spend time and energy and commit your resources to, what is it that kind of put you in the mindset that would focus on something like online extremism? A whole lot of things that a congressman can choose to go after, but you've left your imprint on this set of issues.
Yeah. Well, Nick, thank you so much for your extraordinary leadership and for having this conversation today. Of course, to Ali Soufan, the Soufan Center, thank you for your incredible leadership on the overall issue of public safety and counterterrorism. I don't have any interest in online extremism. I have an interest in extremism and countering extremism and public safety. And we have got to stop looking at things as if online extremism is a separate space. This is all one and the same. And the truth of the matter is that when you look at the issue of counterterrorism, the most likely threat that we continue to face is that of the lone wolf extremist who is self-radicalized in the confines of their own home or someone else's home. And I first, got initially exposed to this issue with the shooting in New Zealand, and where 51 individuals were massacred at a mosque, and the entire thing was done over a live feed, and it took Facebook and other entities days to get it off their platform. What was fascinating after that incident is that we did a meeting with the major tech companies, and they started bragging about their global internet forum to counter terrorism. They said, well, we have the GIF CT. And then we start to kick the tires on this entity, and it turns out it didn't have a leader. Now it does, thankfully, with you. It wasn't an independent NGO, no brick and mortar structure, no budget, nothing. They weren't willing to tell us how much money they were allocating to getting this content off of their platforms. And it became very clear that if we are to continue our dedication to counterterrorism and public safety, then we had to do much more in the space of online extremism. And so that was really, from a legislative and congressional standpoint, that was the origins of this. And it is the number one issue that we have dedicated the last 2 years to.
Well, and that's kind of what drew me into this space too, Max, because, I after a long government career where I had kind of direct involvement in the intelligence side, the policy side, it was clear to me that the whole the problem of extremism and terrorism wasn't something that was going to be solved by government alone, because there's too much surface area out there. There's too much landscape out there that government doesn't control. We can't deploy troops to a conflict zone to solve. We can't collect the kind of intelligence we need to solve this problem using intelligence tools alone. It won't be a law enforcement challenge alone. We're going to need to find a way to bring it together, a coalition that also includes the technology sector, the private sector, because so much of this, as I said a minute ago, the surface area of this problem set is on literally public space like that maintained by Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and other companies. And so I admit it, I kind of had a blind spot during much of my period in government service, where I kind of thought that's where the action was. The action was really a law enforcement, intelligence, and military fight. Well, we know it's a lot more than that now. And if governments are going to succeed in gaining traction against extremists and terrorists, it's only going to be done if we do a much better job of working with the tech sector, of holding the tech sector to account for what happens on their platforms. And I liked what you said a little bit ago, Max, in starting us off by, don't think of this as an online extremism problem. This is a problem of preventing harms to communities and preventing dangerous people from doing things that hurt people. Unfortunately, a lot of times the genesis of that effort or the genesis of that act starts at a very early stage when they're online, maybe communicating with someone who thinks like they do, or buys into the same toxic narrative or ideology that they do. And so I think one of the things that brought me into this effort was the idea that we got to get upstream. We can't simply wait until it is a law enforcement matter. I remember Jim Comey from FBI used to say all the time, by the time I'm involved at FBI, it's way too late. If I've got a case opened on somebody, we're past the point where something should have been done. And that was always a reminder to me that there's a whole lot more work to be done upstream than we've currently been doing as a society.
Yeah, but the thing that I would push back on here is we can't look at this as something new, and that's the biggest problem between the public sector and the tech space. They would say, oh my God, here's technology. It's a whole sector that we find so fascinating and different. Many of us haven't worked in it. Wow, how do we develop government to address it? Stop. We have been engaging in this type of discourse for hundreds of years around how does the government view and regulate the public sector. Tech is big business, and tech is not a sector. Tech is in finance, tech is in automobiles, tech is in energy, tech is in everything. And certainly, if we start to look at the issue of online extremism in the same way that we look at airbag deployability, suddenly everything changes, right? We never think for a second when you consider GM or Ford and their public responsibility for car safety, their public responsibility for vehicular safety. We never think about it in the sense of, well, there's some constitutional rights that stand in the way. No. And if any of them stood up and said, well, we're doing our best, but we've achieved a 92% airbag deployability, there would be riots in the streets. For some reason, though, we look at Silicon Valley as an enclave of 25-year-old white men in hoodies who are supposed geniuses rather than just folks who got lucky, who got rich very quickly. It's not true. They have a public responsibility in the same way that other companies do. There is absolutely no difference. And the second that Washington, D.C. comes to that conclusion, the second that we will actually be able to address these things across the board.
One of the things your comments made me think of, Max, is usually when we think about content moderation, getting this kind of content off of the platforms, we tend to focus in on the micro, kind of as you suggest, success rates. Okay, how much came down? How fast did it come down? Who gets deplatformed? Whose content is allowed to go through? But the question I have is kind of a broader and more systemic one. Is this what you're talking about, what we're talking about? Is this something that is a bug in the system, or is it really the way in which the system is fundamentally architected? The same things that we like and value about social media platforms, the ability to connect with someone on the other end of the planet, the ability to find other like-minded people who believe and share our thoughts and we're aligned with in either as a matter of taste or preference or all kinds of things you could be aligned with someone on the other side of the world on. All of the good things about social media also seem to be the very enablers of the kind of extremist activity that you're speaking out against and that I'm working against. If you can find like-minded good people in this architecture or in this ecosystem, you can just as easily find like-minded bad people who share your malevolent view of the world. So I guess my question back at you is, are we destined or doomed to kind of live with this reality because this is what we've created for ourselves?
No, absolutely not. First of all, this does not come down to the First Amendment. Every one of these platforms has a code of conduct that you sign on to. It's a code of conduct that denies you the ability to put pornography on their sites. It denies the ability to engage in human trafficking and so many other things. It denies you already the ability to promote anyone on the FTO list, the Foreign Terrorist Organization list. So really what we are talking about here is the limits of their business model. Keep in mind that the way in which these platforms make money, and these are public companies, and their primary obligation is to their shareholders, is by keeping eyeballs on their platforms for longer. And so they develop algorithms to point you in directions that will keep you engaged for longer. The problem is that then these algorithms sometimes clue people into extremist activity. There's not nearly enough being done to stop that. And the answer would be very, very simple. It would just be raising the standards by which any content that they accelerate is held to. And it would be the same standard that media companies are held to. If it can't go up on a TV commercial, then they shouldn't be able to accelerate that content and drag more eyeballs to it. That's the first thing that's sensible. Guarantee you their shareholder value would go down. Tough luck. They're rich enough already. The second thing, though, that we really have to start to consider, and this is a complete inverse of how they're doing business right now. Ironically, when you get more followers on these platforms, you are held to a lower standard because they consider what you are doing, quote unquote, newsworthy. It should be the opposite. When you have more followers, when naturally your reach is much larger, you should be held to a higher standard. Again, the standard that I or anyone else is held to when you go on TV or if you put a commercial out there. If they just did those two things, and there are many other things that they should be doing to include addressing extremist content not covered under the FTO bandwidth, they would go a long way towards addressing this. They cannot, though, continue with this notion that they are doing everything that they can do, which is exactly how they approach Washington, D.C. right now in an incredibly elitist manner, that somehow there's nothing else that they can do. It is totally false, totally false.
Well, you mentioned this a few minutes ago. Terms of service are the framework that these companies use. You and I, when we sign up for an account on one of these platforms, we acknowledge the terms of service, we agree to abide by them, and then we can expect to be deplatformed if we stray from them. Is that terms of service framework that you're talking about, is that a sufficient way? So is the problem that the terms of service aren't being enforced rigorously, scrupulously enough, or is it simply a case of we need to invest more, the companies need to invest more in getting more capability to be more on top of it in real time all the time?
No, it's beyond that. It's beyond that, and this is the significance of what you're doing now, because this is a collective action problem. And what you are leading is the first effort in the history of this country to address it as such. Now what we have to make sure is that these companies did not establish the Global Internet Forum to counter terrorism, which I hope one day emerges as not just the GIF-CT, but an entity to also counter hate and extremism online, but that they are not using this to mask the problems that they know are going on in their platforms, but that they truly engage in it in a manner to address what's going on across the space. So ideally, there should be one code of conduct that everyone agrees to whenever they sign up to any type of social platform, to include video game platforms as well. I think that's the first thing. And again, there's precedent for this, so long as we start to look at tech as big business and not just as a special new sector. You think about what financial institutions do for money laundering. Again, there's a key threshold that they all have to engage in. You see what they're doing generally, especially after Dodd-Frank, under capital controls and things like that. You see what energy companies are doing around cybersecurity. They all are conceding that there are collective action problems that they have to address for the good of public safety and for the good of general societal welfare. This is no different, because as much as I am concerned about the big tech platforms, I'm just as much, if not more, concerned about the smaller tech platforms, the Telegrams of the world, the 8chans, the 4chans, so many others, where if the big tech companies adopt certain standards, it certainly pushes a smaller minority of people to these other platforms. But that is a lesser problem, because if someone is finding the lesser platforms, how do they find it? I'll tell you how they find it. They get radicalized in the bigger platforms. You don't just happen upon Telegram. It doesn't go that way. It just doesn't happen, or at least not nearly as frequently. So it is a problem that the entire space faces, and you have to address it as such. That's the significance of your organization, if we can push it to be that.
Well, you put your finger on it when you talked about collective action, and collective action, as you say, is an imperative. It's required. It's demanded here. But I would this is not going to come easy for some of them because they view themselves also as competitors in this space. Now, I think you have to get past that to be able to identify areas where you can engage.
But there's precedent for that.
Yes,
That's
and
my point. It happens in every other industry, virtually every other big business. The problem is, though, this is a culture problem, Nick. And you can't say it publicly. I know that, but I can. That they somehow still view themselves as different. And these are all engineers, and they all have an engineering mindset. And when you have an engineering mindset, you're opposed to anything that introduces friction to the system. I'm sorry, though. This is far too important for us to just be thinking about profitability and efficiency. This is much, much bigger than that. So it would make cars much faster and much cheaper if we didn't consider public safety. So for some reason, still we have this cultural mindset where for every other business, we understand that there's a strong role for regulation and a strong connection between societal good and some type of public-private partnership. Still with tech, though, we don't take that attitude, and that's what has to change.
So you raised the idea of actual regulation, and you've certainly been someone who, during your term of service in Congress, you raised the idea of actually putting more additional regulation around the industry. Is this a problem in your mind that more legislation from a Congress perspective is required or desired, or would you rather the problem be solved in other ways? There's other countries that are taking a more heavy-handed approach to regulation. There are other countries that actually have put, penalties on corporate personnel in some cases.
And what makes this so ironic that companies like the big tech companies are now saying, I'm sorry, we could not survive if you regulated us, while they are getting regulated in other major markets and still flourishing. So you look at what's happening in the EU, where they have actually instituted a quarterly audit system for not just extremism, but for hate language across the spectrum, whereby every quarter the EU releases a report in partnership with these companies where they show basically how well are they doing at getting this content off of their platforms. Because right now what we have a system is these social media companies, every time something ridiculous happens, every time from Holocaust denial all the way to ISIS and Al-Qaeda content, they come back and they say, that was just an outlier. I swear to God, we're doing this 97% efficiency. And we sit there like a bunch of idiots and say, oh, okay, great. And there's no independent arbiter, in whatever shape and form. It is critical, and we've pushed forward with this with something called the Raise the Bar Act, whereby the Department of Homeland Security engages in a partnership with the GIFCT, as well as other entities, to institute a quarterly audit system. Sunlight can be the best disinfectant in this manner. Where we say, look, guys, let's step away from the anecdotal evidence. Here's how well you're doing, and you can build out trusted flaggers with a university system. The EU does this right now. You have not seen any of these companies pull out, and you haven't seen even they're still making money. So they are acting as if, to a certain degree, like they are obstructionists, and they're not showing nearly enough of a sense of urgency. And we have to make sure that just as 2 years ago, they were talking about the GIFCT, saying, well, we have this GIFCT, we're trying our best. Now that they have taken the step of appointing you, building out an independent NGO, we have to make sure that it is real, that it's not just a rubber stamp on their, right now, what is ludicrous activity.
You also raised something really interesting, Max, when you talked about smaller platforms, because we talk about the entry point for this problem, as you say, is thinking about big companies like Facebook or Twitter or YouTube. But if we're really going to get a handle on this problem in a comprehensive way, we're going to have to engage with a whole lot of small companies that are arriving on the scene literally every day. And that's one of the things that I've prioritized early in my time at GIFCT, is trying to figure out, okay, let's identify where are these places, where are these platforms, where are these new arrivers on the scene. And you highlighted one of them, the gaming industry, where bad guys, where extremists are now taking advantage of their connections on those platforms to form real connections. So one of my goals and ambitions for GiftCT is to move beyond the companies that you and I have all heard of before, and instead start identifying a whole host of those companies which may not even realize that they are a problem or have a problem right now. Or if they have a problem, they certainly don't know how to fix it. And again, I think this is where the kind of collective action piece of this that you talked about comes in. If a Facebook can share their hard lessons learned, what they've learned that they do well, what they've learned that they still need a lot of work on in terms of their content moderation, if they can share that downstream with some of these new companies that may only have 10 employees or 20 employees, they don't have legions of content moderators sitting in 24/7 ops center around the world. We got to close that capability gap right now. That capability.
And I would actually venture to say, and I'd love to hear your opinion on this, it's a resource gap as well, not just a capability gap. And in the same way, ironically, that Google and Amazon have been able to outsource server space. So now you start up a company, you don't have to buy your own servers and find a warehouse and this and that. It would be fascinating if content moderation became in and of itself an independent function. So that if your organization had the capability to take content out of any of these platforms, and that in and of itself was a trusted independent entity, that's the vision, I think. Not just saying, hey, because what you don't want to get to, again, unless you disagree, we don't want this to devolve into a sense of we have some type of AI algorithm and we have a shared hashtag database, and that is what we can give to you. Because then the threat constantly stays ahead of us. You know, I do think that there's a human component of this, and there's an intense resource aspect of this that we can't forget about.
You're absolutely right. And that is one of the things that poses a real challenge here is many of these companies at the small end of the spectrum do not have the capacity or the resources to invest in the kind of content moderation capability that comes with a Facebook or a Twitter right now. So they are going to end up relying on processes, algorithmic processes, automated processes. And that, as you pointed out pretty eloquently, that doesn't lead to perfect outcomes. What that means is material can get missed. It does get missed. On the other end of the spectrum, though, that also creates outcomes. And I know you don't define this issue as a freedom of speech issue, but there is a whole sector out there that does watch what GiftCT does watch what the tech sector is doing from the other perspective. They're looking at content moderation as risking overachievement, not underachievement. I'll tell you, I got named to be the head of GiftCT the last couple of days of June. Within the first couple of days of July, I got a letter from 16 or 17 representatives of human rights organizations, principally focused on freedom of expression, who were pleased that I had been named, but they immediately had a set of concerns and even grievances about the way in which GiftCT has engaged with their community before. And I'll be honest, this was a bit of a blind spot for me because I kind of came into it with my mind in the place, in many ways, where your mind has been, is how do we more aggressively get this stuff down off platforms? And I'm still in that mindset. I still carry that mindset. But what I've come away with, based on a summer's worth of engagement with that group of stakeholders, is you got to do it right. If you do it in a way that sweeps counter narrative speech off of the platforms. For example, if you've got a black flag video that gets swept off a platform, but it's actually a video in which the online provider or the poster is mocking the Islamic State or is pushing back on the Daesh's narrative that attracts young people, then we've done something wrong with content moderation if we've been so indiscriminate that we do that. So I guess what I come away having learned after 4 months on the job is that underachievement is bad. Overachievement might also be bad. We've got to find a sweet spot here. And
yeah, I don't know, man.
No.
I don't know, man. Like, this isn't that complicated, right? And you have the FTO list. You and I both know that there are entities that are affiliated with or directly involved with the FTO list who are still engaging in online communication and online recruitment. That's a problem that has not been fully addressed. That's step one. Step two, there are things, if I can't do it in real life, right? If I can't spray paint it, if I can't say it with a microphone, if I can't go on TV and do it, then it should not be happening online. And particularly, again, these algorithms should not be pushing people to it, which is something that I hope you will be addressing. These are issues that over the course of the last century, we have already addressed. Let's not allow this to devolve into something that is supposedly contentious when in reality it is not. There's too much low-hanging fruit out there for us to get sucked into this. If years from now, you have gotten to the point with this organization and with these efforts where there are these types of legitimate debates about what your next step is, hallelujah. We are nowhere near that. You know that, and I know that, and these organizations know that too. So I just don't think that's a sensible argument at all. These organizations have failed too much, or they don't care to the extent, the tech platforms, to the extent that the freedom of speech entities don't have a leg to stand on as to what should be done right now.
So you raise also an interesting point when you
do you disagree with what I just said though?
Well, I guess what I have a hard time doing is putting a volume figure on some of what I've heard, but what I am persuaded by is that some of the content moderation activities pursued by companies so thus far, which may not go far enough in your point of view and in my point of view, produce unintended consequences. And some of those unintended consequences include destroying or inhibiting some forms of speech that have societal value. And I'll give you one other concrete example. ISIS videos that might have appeared on Facebook a few years ago before Facebook did a better job of dealing with ISIS videos. ISIS videos that showed really horrific violations of human rights, for example, or even atrocities or war crimes. If Facebook takes those off of their platforms, which they should, but doesn't take them off of their platform in the right way so that that material is preserved, then what you've lost is evidence of war crimes that might be used in some proceeding that would bring to justice the very perpetrators that we're trying to kick off of a place like Facebook. So that's a pretty compelling anecdotal case to me, and it's just one of several I've heard, where if you do it too well, then you end up having some unintended consequences, this kind of reservoir of material that should be available somehow for pursuit of justice in some of these conflict zones overseas. That's just one example. Your FTO list reference a few minutes ago, Max, made me smile, the foreign terrorist organizations list, because it's clear, it's something I worked on, of course, in government, and we had legislative parameters that guided how we named organizations as foreign terrorist organizations. And of course, the UN has a process for designating organizations as global terrorist organizations. That's where the companies, in my experience, are the most comfortable, when there is the predictability and reliability of having a framework provided by someone else that says ISIS, the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, or the many Al-Qaeda affiliate organizations, they're proscribed, so therefore you have to take their material down. And even when that predictable framework exists, as you say, the work still isn't done, not by any means. It gets much, much harder, though, when you look into the other side of the extremist landscape, the one you and I and others are so focused on right now, where we don't have that FTO framework as a guide. Where the companies are left relying on their own terms of service, and then you can argue whether that's sufficient or insufficient, but they don't have the ability to just say, Proud Boys have been labeled such and such by a government or by the UN, so boom, no optionality here. We'll just take what we take down and nobody can sue us. It's all over, game over. So bottom line, from my perspective at GIFT-CT, we've got to find some way to regularize an approach to dealing with those other forms of extremism, whether they're racially or ethnically motivated, right-wing motivated, anti-Semitic, racist, any of them.
Well, there's two separate things here. The first is whether or not you're willing to, these platforms are willing to get the content down, or whether or not they're able to. Now, I worked with the Trump administration to get the Russian imperial movement designated as an especially designated terrorist group. The first time that a white supremacist organization was designated as an FTO or an STDG, what happened the next day was fascinating, which was that their content was taken down off the major tech platforms. Now, they could have done that a year prior. They chose not to because they needed the outside blessing. So these entities have started to look at these lists as basically the independent arbiter of what is acceptable content and what is not. So one option is for the GIF-CT to push for different entities to be labeled. The second, though, is to say, screw that list in and of itself. There's no reason why that permission is mandatory. The Russian imperial movement's content could have been taken down for years. You didn't have to wait for the STDG list to be expanded. So I would push back on this just to say that what's partly beautiful about this opportunity here is, rather than waiting for government to lead, the private sector can lead this effort. It doesn't have to go the way as it's gone previously.
Well, this is an area where you and I are thinking alike. Because again, as early as when I first had my first conversations earlier this year with the companies about taking on this role, I set as a pretty clear objective, actually even a condition of employment as far as I was concerned. I wasn't interested in doing this if all we were going to do was focus on content tied to terrorist organizations designated by the UN, because I knew what that meant. It meant exactly what you said. It meant one segment of the marketplace in terrorist and extremist ideology is locked down, but the rest of that marketplace does not carry that designator, and therefore, I wouldn't say operates with free reign, but they don't operate with nearly the constraints on them that you see when you're talking about a designated terrorist organization. So I've set it as an objective at GIF-CT. How do we move to a definitional taxonomy framework that doesn't just have us waiting for the next designation list to come from government? We've got to move beyond that. I wouldn't say it's either or. I think it's designation plus. We do all of the stuff that the designations require, but that ought not be the limiting factor. That ought to be the outer edge of what the sector or companies can do in this space.
And it's an interesting culturally, because Facebook's mantra was move fast and break things, right? And they all have this idea that, hey man, we have this libertarian ethos and we're in the private sector, we're the innovators. But on this issue of extremist content, you could not be more cautious and more risk averse and more blinded to societal consequences than these tech companies have been. So it's this fascinating situation where you have this public servant who was a leader in the government space, wanting to move faster and be more innovative than the private sector people. And I'm looking forward to seeing how this plays out, because they can't. I think it's unacceptable for them to be hypocrites on this. You want to move fast and be super exciting about the next iteration of the news feed, but when it comes to taking extremist content down, you become more cautious than longtime government public servants. It's an odd dynamic.
Well, I've also had to learn early on in my tenure, Max, to be very careful about using the word they, because the word they connotes a unanimity of view across companies and the sector that right now I don't see. Even on some of the modest questions that have come up in the first couple months of my tenure, I can't say that everybody in the sector, even executives inside the same companies, see things the same way. So,
I'm sorry to disagree with you so much in this conversation, but I'm at liberty to say some things, I guess, a little in a different way right now. If we are giving the tech space far too much freedom for diversity of opinion around issues that in other sectors, they would never feel free to say those things. So go to the energy space right now, especially after something like BP. And see if anyone is willing to openly say, I think we can be a little more lax around, security at our oil rigs. I don't think you'll find it, although you might, but it certainly wouldn't be nearly as societally acceptable as it is for someone in the tech space to say we need to be more lax or maintain the status quo as it pertains to extremist content. This does go back to how we are viewing and interacting with a culture that is centered around Silicon Valley that is totally against criticism from outside of it and believes that they are intellectually superior as well. And that I think is something that we have to address or force them to change. The fact that there is a diversity of opinion in the space right now around this just speaks to the ways in which they have largely existed in a silo that has to be broken down.
And I'll tell you, I'm still doing a lot of learning in this role, and one of the things I've learned not to do is make assumptions about, the private sector acts in a more agile, more smooth, all of the things we used to think about ourselves when we were in government. Bureaucracies are slow, or it's so much easier in the private sector for the battleship to move in one direction or another. I don't assume that anymore. I find working with the private sector to be every bit as challenging as working with government, and all of those things I might have assumed in a positive way about the agility and ability to kind of turn on a dime. I don't make those assumptions anymore. I've also, though, figured out, Max, that as much as we're talking about this in a U.S. public policy space, you as a member of Congress, me as a former American government official, we're working and dealing here in the United States. This is really a global problem, and so at least 80% of my time right now is spent dealing with other stakeholders overseas, to include governments like the French government, the United Kingdom government, the New Zealand government, the government of Japan, the government of Jordan. I think that's a good thing, because I don't think we have any monopoly on wisdom here in the United States. And these platforms have reach into every one of our societies. And so I actually think it's a good thing for other societies to have a voice in bringing the tech sector an accountability framework to the tech sector. I wonder if you've got any perspective on that.
My opinion is that it is not nearly as much of a global collective action problem as climate change is, or even the movement of capital, or even the movement of jobs, or even the movement of people. And again, what I'm very cautious about here when it comes to this is the ability for the leaders of the American tech space to kind of give rhetorical stiff arms to focus our attention to other places. There is an American problem right now. There is a problem with the ways in which American citizens and residents of this country are being subjected to extremist content across the ideological spectrum, and it has to be immediately addressed, to the point that, especially on far-right extremism, we are exporting that ideology in the same manner that Saudi Arabia has exported Wahhabist ideologies and jihadist terrorist ideologies for multiple decades, if not generations. So whereas if we were setting out to address climate change, I would say, okay, it is clear as day that if you do not have some type of global framework for action, we are putting our head in the sands and we're not addressing this. There's an American problem right now that we have got to address. And what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to sit by and let anyone distract us from that by pointing to things that are happening abroad and problems abroad, which of course exist. But there's an American problem that is gigantic in its nature. Gigantic.
Well, no, I don't see any disagreement between us there. In fact, when I left government, kind of one of the motivating factors I had for kind of playing the role I'm playing now was, hey, this is a problem here. This is a distinctly American problem. We saw it all the more acutely in an election year where passions were all that much more heightened, and it drew from the woodwork all of those extremist voices that you're referring to. But what the reason I take some encouragement from the fact that there's a global dimension to this problem is that pressure on the companies will come not just from members of Congress in Washington, it will come from the marketplace around the world. Because there are other countries around, many countries around the world where the population feels equally poorly served by companies in terms of this content moderation process.
My hope is eventually that we follow the frameworks that we have engaged in for global financial regulation, to global trade regulation, to global human rights regulation, and apply that to online content, online extremist content and online hate content. There's no doubt that that is needed. But in each of those entities or each of those sectors, we got it right, or at least establish something nationwide before trying to consider the global. And that I think is just what we have to do right now. We can't skip the national issue. And it's one reason why, again, to bring the conversation full circle, that it is so vital that the federal government institute legislation in partnership with your organization and organizations like it to hold these companies accountable on a nationwide basis, as well as to allow for more innovation in this space. If we just make this a barrier to entry into the market, it will only benefit the top 4 companies too. I want to see more competition in this space as well. So you could provide a framework that's backed up by resources to allow for more innovation in this space as well.
Well, that's certainly the objective of GIFCT, is to try to raise the standard across the board, raise the performance level across the board. Big companies, small companies, American companies, whoever is participating. And again, getting back to something you mentioned earlier, a lot of what drove progress in this area, or at least progress in terms of establishing an independent GIFCT, it was the horrific event in Christchurch, New Zealand that you referred to a while back. It galvanized, action, not just here in America, but actually globally. You had the president of France, the prime minister of New Zealand, and a whole host of world leaders gathering to say this can't stand, more must be done. I spend my time now saying, what do we want to do? Because the next Christchurch is going to come, or something awful will happen at some point. What can we do? What should we do? What must we do between now and then, so that we at least can satisfy ourselves that we've taken this problem seriously before we find ourselves in that situation again? I don't want to wake up the day after the next Christchurch and say, there were 5 more things I wish we had worked harder and faster on. That's not an answer. So pressure from important voices like yours, pressure from other important voices around the United States and around the world, I think is important. It's going to keep that pressure on me, on the sector, to continue to improve performance here. And as you said, performance has to be measurable here. That's all there is to it. You can't just kind of wave your hand at these problems and say, we're doing better, we're trying harder.
100%, 100%. That's why we're all so excited to see the ways in which you move fast and break things.
Well, I'm certainly trying to move fast. I'm next week going to put out a new website redesign, which will announce the plans to hire at least 2 to 3 more individuals to work with me in this. We're quickly trying to build an organization with some capability. Not as fast, I know, as you want, Max, but trust me, I hear your voice over my shoulder and in my ear pretty much every day when I go to work, which is a good thing. And whether that's in Congress or out of Congress, I hope that continues. It's building relationships with people who care about the issues that I care about is what makes this rewarding. So,
and I'm just so honored to be working with you on this, proud of your leadership, and excited to see everything that you accomplish in this space. Thank you again.
Well, I know we're running up against time, but I want to make sure we thank Ali and the team at the Soufan Group and Soufan Center for all that they do on terrorism and extremism issues. You led off that way, Max. We're both here because we believe in the work they're doing and in the partnerships they've created around the globe. So thanks to Ali and his team for everything they do all year long, but also for this year's event. Even though we couldn't gather in Doha in person, I know it was a privilege to be able to participate today with my friend Max.
Thanks again, Nick.
Thank you.
All right.
Hi, everyone. I'm Adrienne LaFrance, the Atlantic's executive editor. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am joined today with Joshua Geltzer, a senior director for counterterrorism at the NSC, now teaching at Georgetown Law, and Brett Schaefer, fellow for disinformation at the Alliance for Securing Democracy. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being here with me. And today we're going to talk about domestic extremism in the United States and how it has been fueled by the growth of conspiracy theories, including movements like QAnon. Also, how these same channels for disinformation are used by foreign actors trying to sow chaos in the United States. So lots to touch on here in the aftermath of a very chaotic and sort of still shaking out election in terms of the political response, and certainly in terms of the disinformation. So I wanted to start there, actually, looking at social platforms in this moment. And I'm curious to hear from both of you, maybe starting with you, Josh, about what we've seen social platforms like Twitter and Facebook do in terms of trying to curb disinformation in the past 4 weeks, and how that's different than what we've seen in the past 4 years. What's changed?
And let me just begin by thanking Global Security Forum and all the great folks at the Soufan Center for the chance to be part of this great conversation with both of you, which I've really been looking forward to. So I do think we saw the leading social media companies and other communications platforms almost girding for battle as the 2020 election unfolded in a way that we didn't see in 2016. I think even the companies would admit that 2016 caught them a bit flat-footed. Hindsight may have revealed just how flat-footed it was. 2020, there was a sense that the challenges would be there, but I think the types of challenges nonetheless brought certain surprises. So you did see in particular companies like Facebook and Twitter looking for what they sometimes call coordinated inauthentic behavior. That's Facebook's term. Things that are going viral, not because they're organically viral, but because a deliberate operation, really an intelligence services influence operation, has made it so and has worked hard to leverage certain tools to make it so. They tried to catch those. They tried to catch them sooner rather than later, though they often had spread to many users, because that's the virality of these platforms, even before they were caught. And they tried to identify it, to out it in a sense publicly, in the hope that being armed or being warned is being armed, that if Americans know this stuff is being foisted upon them, maybe they're a bit better place to discount it, and avoid sharing it further themselves. And I think with respect to foreign governments, there was some greater success. I think with respect to one particular topic area, disinformation about when to vote, how to vote, whether one could still vote, there was a deliberate effort. But, and I'll say one more thing, and then I'm sure we'll come back to all of this in the course of the conversation. I think one thing that cropped up in the 2020 cycle, for which we will look back and say there is still a lot more work to be done, is when the source of disinformation comes from within. When it's domestic rather than foreign, when it's official government actors, and when they are deliberately spreading things that I think we can fairly call lies about the electoral system, how it works, and what it has yielded. And that seems to be the big challenge of 2020. And I think it's fair to say there wasn't sufficient preparation, because a lot of lies are spreading quite rampantly as we speak.
Well, and I want to go back to this sort of targeted approach in terms of what these platforms focused on. But I also first want to just kind of put a broad question to Brett, which is, what do you think took them so long? I mean, you're right, Josh, that there was this 2016 wake-up call. Why did it take four full years for us to get to a point where an obvious lie was being called out?
Well, I think in some ways elections are one of the easier things for the platforms to moderate, because they can fall back on their civic integrity, protocols that they have in place. So they have made a concerted effort for years to focus on the election. I mean, one of the things we have tried to stress over the last 4 years is disinformation is not just about elections. And in fact, even if the ultimate kind of goal is to influence to some degree the outcome of an election, that's a process that takes a very, very long time. It just doesn't pop up the day of an election or 2 days before. That you really have to look at this as sort of a continuous thing that starts chipping away at people's sort of faith in democratic processes, their faith in sort of objective facts and things like that. So it's somewhat concerning that there's always this push at just looking at this very sort of discrete time period around an election. Because of course, if you go back to what Russia did in 2016, that was years in the making when they had these accounts and assets that popped up and started to integrate themselves into American conversations and sort of slowly sort of manipulate them from within. So to answer your question about why it took them this long, I mean, I think just because the election was such a pivotal event, and it was in some ways easier for them to focus on an election rather than just conversations day in, day out. I think what we saw, though, is that in many ways, their efforts kind of backfired. I mean, they didn't really work. And as Josh kind of laid out, where this kind of leaves us right now is we saw in the last 4 weeks probably the most aggressive moderation in the history of social media companies. And still, this was probably the greatest disinformation event in the history of social media. So what that leaves you with is either their efforts are just completely ineffective, or that we have to be looking at solutions that don't rely on Facebook and Twitter to moderate our way out of this mess. Because the point Josh made that we just really don't have an answer for is what happens when disinformation starts with a genuine American who has a large organic following. The platforms just don't have an answer for that. I frankly don't have an answer for that, because everything we pushed them towards was to try to make conversations more authentic, to root out bots, to root out all of the sort of manipulative techniques that were used to sort of create this illusion of authenticity, to manufacture consensus. But if you have an account that has 10 million followers, and that account is sort of the super spreader of disinformation, they have no way of quarantining it. And we saw them try with the New York Post story, and it just completely failed. And so I think the challenge going forward is, how do we address that problem? Because then you're getting into efforts to try to censor oftentimes real Americans, American outlets, and you have to do it so quickly to have any impact that I just don't know. I don't know how we deal with that problem. That's, I think, the sort of lasting takeaway from what we saw during this election cycle.
Well, and adding complexity, of course, and one of the major sources of disinformation is the president of the United States. And then there's this whole newsworthiness component where, I think people reasonably want to have easy access to what the president is saying, but also without there being harm caused. The other thing I've been thinking about with regard to President Trump is the extent to which even, people have floated this idea of whether he should be removed from Twitter once he's a private citizen, or, some have argued sooner, but that even if he were to be deplatformed, that his audience would still find him. And so, to me, there's always this line between how much is performative, like we're doing this big splashy thing to address the thing people are upset about, versus how much actually changes our informational environment in a healthy way. I'm curious at what you two think about whether the president should be allowed to be on Twitter. Josh, you're first.
I'm happy to start, and I'll maybe start at a slightly more generalized level, which is this deplatforming question, which is, does taking someone or some set of actors who are repeat offenders, spreading disinformation, harmful disinformation, sometimes that could even lead to violence, does taking them off a platform help? And I think from somebody who used to work on counterterrorism, the answer was it was never a silver bullet solution. But did it help? Yes, because what terrorists, especially terrorists who are trying to reach often from abroad into a domestic population and incite violence, they need new audience members. They need people who might be vulnerable to their siren call and then go down a road of radicalization that leads to violence. And can those terrorists then pop up on vConcate? Can they pop up on enclosed chat rooms that are end-to-end encrypted? Yes, they can. They're not gone from spreading disinformation, or sometimes it's not a matter of disinformation with terrorists. It's just incitement to violence. It's not so much about falsity or truth as encouraging unlawful, awful things. But not having them in a place where they can find new followers and find new individuals who might be susceptible to their call, that still seemed like progress. It wasn't the end of things of progress. Here's the problem then when we talk about somebody like President Trump. He has already built such an astonishingly large following that you worry about what it means to have that person removed, because a lot of those followers will find that person wherever they pop up next, whatever platform. And there are platforms, as you both know, that have said there are no rules here. Essentially, anyone can have this as their platform. And what does it add to their almost martyr-like status, their mythos, that they can say those powerful tried to silence us, which is, of course, what President Trump has already said. He already claims that his follower count is being unfairly cut. He claims that he and his allies suffer unfair content moderation. It reminds me a bit of what he said early on to a member of the media. He says, the reason I always attack you all is so that nobody believes you when you report on things, even if they're true, being the subtext. And here, I think he's beat up on the platform so much that if they were to remove him, he has laid the groundwork for characterizing that in a way that, in a sense, increases his message, or at least gives it life in new form. So it's not a clear answer to your yes or no question, but I think it shows the complexity of having, in a sense, enabled Trump to have the audience he now has. It's very hard to deal with at this point.
And you also see like these other platforms like Gab, for example, lumping together mainstream media with big tech as a sort of like force working together, which of course doesn't reflect reality. But Brett, what about you? Do you think the president should be allowed on Twitter?
Well, before getting that, I would say that's also RT and Sputnik's narrative, is lumping the corporate media with big tech, with the elites. Like it's all part of this sort of grand conspiracy. But going back to the question, and I would again just echo Josh's point, I think deplatforming works, but it needs to work very early in the process of building an audience. So QAnon, I think QAnon could have been snuffed out and should have been snuffed out, but that needed to happen in 2017 when we started to see it really taking root. And if you would have done that then, there's no way QAnon would be what it is today, because it needed a space like Facebook that has kind of a large enough general audience to continue to gain followers. As Josh laid out, if you have the president, if you have another sort of key figure like Alex Jones, they have enough of a following at this point that when they move to another platform, they bring that audience with them. Maybe not all of them, but enough of them to continue to have a voice. So what we saw in the last week, for example, is we saw this movement for conservatives to leave Facebook and Twitter and go to Parler. So, now this is something that's not just happening in kind of the radical fringes of the internet, where we saw this, again, back in 2017, as soon as Twitter started taking more aggressive action, we saw a movement to push people onto Gab. But that was sort of in the white nationalist community and the sort of Russian troll community. Now this is, my aunt and uncle that are moving to Parler. So that, I think, is the danger of deplatforming somebody who already has a platform. I'm not against deplatforming. I think it does work, but it's got to work really early in the process of audience building, because once there is an organic audience there, they'll take that audience somewhere else. And frankly, it's probably going to be more destructive in a place that, is not policed. There's not sort of other voices out there that are pushing back against it. So I think deplatforming Trump now, I think that would be detrimental, frankly.
It's really interesting. You mentioned the risk of taking an audience to a place that's more detrimental, because I've thought about this a lot in the context of Facebook, that, the way that Facebook describes itself as a community and as a force for a more open world, and like pick your other sort of sunny sounding way of characterizing Facebook. And yet we see very practically the real world harm that can be caused by disinformation on Facebook, specifically on other platforms, which we'll also get to. And so I've found myself at times wondering, like, would it be better for humanity if we just had platforms that weren't so sort of like secretly algorithmically determined in terms of what people see, and not pushing QAnon or whatever other conspiracy theory of the day is spreading like wildfire across them? And it brings you to the question of sort of like an 8kun type platform, which is the successor to 4chan, which folks are probably familiar with. And objectively, the content on 8kun is reprehensible. I mean, it's really awful. And yet it's all user generated. So the community is just plainly what the people there are there to talk about. And I've found myself sort of wondering, like, which is actually more harmful? A community of like terrible misogynists posting racist, hateful things, objectively bad, or a community that sort of bills itself as being a force for good, when in fact there's some really insidious, nefarious things taking place there. And is that even the right way to think about like 8kun versus Facebook? I'm really curious for both of your views on that.
What a dreadful set of choices when you frame it that way, Adrian. But it's a great and fascinating question, because the idea of a free-for-all sounds really bad until you see what the purportedly moderated and curated set of platforms is yielding, and it doesn't have the kind of visceral horrors of some of what they remove, and which their algorithms have gotten better and better at removing, or at least flagging for humans to remove quickly. But there's really insidious stuff that isn't just graphically violent or otherwise on its face bad, but when it's, for example, as you've written about, when it's QAnon and it's really changing how Americans think about themselves, their government, law, it may not be, blood on screen, but it can really do a lot of damage. Now, I guess in a world in which the big platforms are, in a sense, they appear here to stay, and in which something other than a free-for-all seems essential to their economic model, I think what at least a lot of us hold out hope could make it better and be feasible is some transparency with respect to those algorithms, some sense that researchers like Brett and others, if they could have better access to it, might help the companies themselves, the rest of us, government, understand why some of the stuff that proves so dangerous and harmful spreads as quickly as it does. And maybe if companies had the benefit of all that input and frankly pressure to alter that in various ways, you could have, I won't call it the best of both worlds, but at least less bad set of options than the two you laid out, Adrian.
And I want to go in a second, Brett, to you about algorithms. But before I do that, I'm curious, Josh, from a counterterrorism perspective, which, again, two terrible choices I'm laying out here, but which is more desirable in terms of like, is it easier for law enforcement to find people who are planning really harmful, terrorist attacks, whatever it may be, domestic extremism? Is it preferable to have it centralized to a big mainstream platform like Facebook versus these little corners, sort of dark corners of the internet? Or I'm just sort of curious from a counterterrorism perspective, which keeps us safer? Like which version of the internet is safer for everybody?
Having terrorist content, their recruitment, propaganda material sit on the major platforms, even if that meant that they didn't try as aggressively to have very graphic stuff once the platforms became better at pleasing, was still really dangerous, because what we found in government and what researchers have documented is that it's not just the graphic stuff that brings people in to the terrorist world. In fact, it's often stuff that one researcher, Sir Charlie Winter, has called the theme of warmth, of community, of belonging. So it's videos that on their face don't appear awful. They are terrorist content, to be sure, but they would show ISIS's attempt at a marketplace, showing different, almost cosmopolitan gatherings, different foods being brought into a place like Raqqa, Syria, and being cooked by those who've joined this purported caliphate they've been built. And the appeal of those could be as damaging, could be as great, could be what draws in someone who says, well, this is not what I thought ISIS was all about based on mainstream media reporting. I'd like to learn more. And then those other types of content fill out their sense of the group and fill out their sense of what the group might want them to do, such as joining them on the battlefield or engaging in violence. So even that stuff that's on its face, maybe harder to detect, but reaches a wider audience, we really were worried about it in the counterterrorism community.
Well, and that goes to a point you were making earlier, Brett, about these sort of like already well-grooved channels for disinformation. I mean, I certainly think of QAnon in this category just because of its sprawling nature. You can kind of like plop any conspiracy theory you want into a QAnon group and find a receptive audience. But Brett, I'm curious for your views on sort of which channels are most pronounced. And on the platform, certainly we know that the major platforms with huge audiences are the places where these channels get established. But are there things you're noticing about how sort of channels used for disinformation are then repurposed or reimagined and their sort of staying power?
Well, to go back to something Josh said that I think is important to kind of address that question, like I think the real concern is less of the extreme for people who are already radicalized and the edges of the extreme, and what the algorithms and the way platforms are organized do to push people to one side or the other. And that, I think, is the real challenge of leaving some of the more problematic content up on YouTube or Facebook. Is, the extreme is going to find the extreme content, and they're going to find those communities. What we're concerned about are those 15, 20% who maybe dip their toes in the water and get sort of pushed headfirst into the lake of conspiracy and hate speech and all the other nonsense. And so I think that goes back to how platforms are organized, how content is presented in front of people, but also, I mean, to address your question of really thinking through, how do we want these platforms to look, and how bad actors are trying to basically play with the architecture of the sites and build into their kind of organization of how to move people around, not only the individual platform, but off platform from the start. I mean, that's now baked into the strategy. So what we saw this week with the Stop the Steal movement on Facebook, I mean, that group was gaining, I'm going to screw up the numbers here, but like 1,000 new followers every minute kind of thing. And what they had sort of built in from the beginning is, we are going to be shut down at some point. We know Facebook is going to moderate this. So they had set up alternative websites. They had set up funding mechanisms through these sort of charitable donation kind of apps and widgets, so that now when we see these movements start on larger platforms, they kind of know that their time is limited, so that they have built alternative channels, so that they have all of these kind of tentacles out there, so that if one gets cut off, they already have the way of kind of redirecting people to different parts of the ecosystem. And so it's like, as we get better at dealing with the problem and understanding how disinformation propagates and how recruitment happens, the bad actors are also getting better, and they're kind of building into their plans from the beginning of how to move people around once platforms start taking a more aggressive approach. And then it's also built into the narrative of it, of like, look, we told you that big tech was going to censor us, and they did. So now, let's keep the movement going on this other platform. And so I think it's important to think of the whole thing as an ecosystem, because different platforms have different purposes. Some in a sort of technical way of like, YouTube is going to host a video that gets spread through Twitter that then is, housed in communities on Facebook, but also of how to move people once the platforms start taking action, and to have different communities set up so you keep the movement alive.
Well, and what you're saying also really sort of elucidates the need for these large tech companies to be, I mean, clearly they need to operate independently by their own values, but also like if one major platform has like the world's most transparent algorithm, that's all well and good. But if people are setting up huge organic audiences across different platforms, it only does so much, basically.
And the platforms have gotten a lot better about communicating amongst one another some of these big threats. So Facebook, Twitter, Google, when we started looking at this problem 3 years ago, we would see one of them take action against a certain community, and then they would have links to their sort of alternative channels that just wouldn't be touched for a very long time. I mean, there was just no coordination there of Twitter saying, hey, we're finding this thing, it looks to be a Russian troll community. Facebook, you probably want to deal with the channels that are also on your platform. So they've gotten much better, if you're looking at the big three, maybe include Reddit and a few others. Where they're limited is bringing the small and medium-sized platforms into the fold, where a lot of this stuff starts bubbling up, or as I mentioned, gets pushed off to. And the reason they can't bring them in the fold is many of them are set up explicitly to kind of house some of this bad behavior. So they can't bring the trust and safety person, I don't think exists, but if it did for 4chan or 8kun, into some of these Facebook decisions of, hey, we've got this community here that's problematic, because 8kun would say, great, let's try to foster that community. So I think that's a problem, is figuring out how the platforms communicate amongst one another, especially since some of them, as we've discussed, are set up with the purpose of being a home to people who are deplatformed.
Right. Well, and it doesn't help either that they're economically competitive with one another. Speaking of the economics of it, I'm curious for your views about, I mean, we've talked a little bit about algorithmic transparency, but knowing that and I'll focus on Facebook just because it's an easy and salient example, but like knowing that the way that Facebook makes its money is off of being able to match the right ads with the right users and determining what users see which ads requires the data that the users are putting into the system, and that some degree of opacity actually helps them have a strong case for their model being special and for their audience being huge. Is there any way to, like, to me, the need for algorithmic transparency may be directly at odds with Facebook's economic incentives. So what do we do? What should be done? What should the algorithmic transparency look like? And how do we get there is another way of asking that.
Well, to start with, I don't think you can have full transparency in the sense of like, this is just made public and anyone can see it, because as we know, that then gives a roadmap for bad actors to exploit it. That said, I mean, there are many different industries that have to be transparent with independent third-party regulators, where it's not just that they're like, banks are not publishing everything that they have to give to certain regulators. You can do that with an independent outside group having the ability to look under the hood. That doesn't mean Google has to all of a sudden sort of publish, which frankly wouldn't be all that helpful because it'd be too complicated for most people to understand their full sort of algorithmic.
Or you'd be looking at like computer code.
Exactly. So there just has to be an independent audit of the companies. It doesn't mean they have to be fully publicly transparent. And of course, as you mentioned, that is their business model. Like the reason people go to Google is Google generally works better as a search engine than Bing. So to be forced to just release like how the special sauce is made, would be problematic. But I think it also goes back to the first point that you made about advertisers. There needs to be a lot of work in terms of looking at the ad ecosystem and the amount of fraud that's happening there, and how much disinformation is financed unwittingly by advertisers because they have no insight whatsoever into where their ads are placed. So if we look off of Facebook and off of YouTube and just look at sort of the website ecosystem and how ad tech works, most responsible advertisers do not want their brand to appear on a white nationalist site. And there are checks in place that should keep that from happening, but it happens all the time. And advertisers just don't know. I mean, they have no more ability to know where their ads are placed than like a sleeping giant or the groups that try to pressure companies to place ads with more responsible advertisers. But I think the advertising ecosystem is something we have not paid enough attention to. And if you got to the ad fraud problem and how much of this is really for profit, I mean, even QAnon, where like the start of QAnon clearly was politically motivated, but now it's just filled with a bunch of grifters selling Q merchandise. So if you are able to kind of wipe out the financial incentives, you at least shrink the problem, and you don't get rid of the problem clearly. But focusing on the money and how these sites are monetized, that would do a world of good for at least, minimizing the problem, if not eliminating it.
Josh, I'm curious for your views on one of the things I've sort of probably naively found myself thinking about over the years is the extent to which, like, oh, maybe some really smart entrepreneur will just come along and make a better social platform, or, disrupt Amazon in some interesting way. And I'm curious for your views on, have we reached the point where like regulation is the only way to begin to solve this problem, or is there some other force by which we could make a better internet that doesn't require government intervention?
It's worth remembering that the way Facebook kind of knocked out MySpace, which seemed like it was here to stay in the early days of social media, was because Facebook was actually the cleaner, safer platform that regulated itself better. You weren't as besieged by, frankly, pornography, among other things, but trolling and violence too. And so it's interesting to see it as the cleaner one that now has so many problems itself, even as they work hard and have a lot of well-intentioned people trying to get at those problems. So I think what makes it seem like the current companies that have such a foothold are likely to maintain them is the fact that they are so large and they have such capital that other products that come along that could conceivably either carve out market share doing roughly what they do, or just take people into a different way of communicating, these big companies buy them. They buy them and they either incorporate their designs into their existing products, or they continue to have a semi-independent existence, a branded existence, but we know who owns them. Think of WhatsApp being owned by Facebook, even YouTube being owned by Google. That was a number of years ago, but that was a big
Instagram, like
acquisition.
Facebook. I feel like there's still this cultural sense that Instagram is like the better platform, and it's like, no, it's still Facebook.
It's still the same. And, this is in a wide array of emerging technologies. So technologies about virtual reality, technologies that deploy AI, things that could change the way we all interact and engage online, not even just social media, but things that deserve new titles. They are largely being bought at even just a promising stage of development by companies that have extraordinary amounts of cash. And I am not an antitrust expert. I know there are a lot of strong views among the antitrust community about whether these should or shouldn't be allowed to continue. But if these sorts of purchases do continue, the idea that some other company will reach a point of really elbowing out the big ones as we know them for market share and remaining independent, it just seems less likely than it did when we used to think of a Silicon Valley where the next really hot thing, really sleekly designed product could make it big.
Right. I also wanted to ask you, and Brett, maybe I'll go to you for this one first, about scale from another perspective. So not just the sheer size of these companies and how cash rich they are, but the scale of audience. And one thing I've been thinking about is, often in the realm of thinking about moderation and how to tackle disinformation that's already there, but you could think about it just in larger, more philosophical terms too, is there a point at which a platform is too big to be good? Like, what was the magic number of users where Facebook was still like more good than bad, or Twitter or Google for that matter? And maybe that's not the right way to think about it, but I'm really curious, Brett, what you think. Like, how much is the scale the problem here?
I honestly don't know. It's a great question. I've never thought of it in those terms before. I mean, I've thought of it in terms of how sophisticated the platform becomes, and as they become better at prioritizing content and sort of making the user experience better, I think you have seen that, like, as you've moved in that direction, you've moved in the other direction in terms of the like health of the information environment on the platform. But I've never thought of it in terms of the user base as much as like the sophistication of the platform itself. Because, like, when I joined Facebook 2007, it kind of was what it still presents itself as being, where, it was a place I could connect with people from high school, and I was living overseas, and it really was just that sort of community environment. And then as it became more and more sophisticated, in many ways made the user experience, quote unquote, better in terms of giving you more options and more things you could do, I found the experience to get worse and worse and worse. And I don't know if those two are directly related, if it's also bringing in just like that was the political environment. But it's something I've noticed on other platforms, but I haven't thought of it in terms of the scale question before.
I want to go to foreign interference, just in the interest of time. And I'm curious, maybe Josh, I'll start with you, to hear about what you've noticed. I mean, I'm thinking about 2016, it seemed, at least from someone not inside of a large social platform or government, just as a journalist, that our sense of the level and breadth of interference in the 2016 election sort of seemed to drip out, to the point that over the course of a year, it was like, okay, wow, that was actually really bad, but we didn't have a full picture for a long time. What sense do we have now of what's happened this time around, and how much do you think we still have yet to learn? And also, if you could sort of describe the nature of the interference as we've seen it so far.
It's such a great reminder that we didn't, at this point in the 2016 cycle, have at all our arms around the extent of the foreign interference. Now, I do think we had a lot more and really sophisticated eyeballs watching, right? We had folks at various think tanks in the media monitoring this up to and during the election. So in a sense, I do expect us to know more faster. And we're seeing folks like Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab already begin to issue their reports on what they've seen. But it is an important reminder that we shouldn't expect the full scope of that until we can really sift through it. And I hope that the companies are themselves doing an after action the way we in government sometimes would do after actions to understand things better than in the moment that they were unfolding. Now, real quickly, what seems to have happened is it seems like a lot of the innovations that companies came up with after 2016 did at least change the nature of foreign interference. So accounts didn't build the massive followings that they once did. Paid advertising often got scrutinized because of new restrictions in ways that happened relatively little in 2016. But of course, bad actors adapt. That's what bad actors do. Instead of having fewer really large accounts, meaning with large followings, there were more accounts with smaller followings. And if they were disrupted, taken down, suspended, if particular content was removed, they rejuvenated because they anticipated having to rejuvenate, knowing that this was in some ways a different sort of cat and mouse game that had been in 2016. And then just most astonishingly, I don't know whether this gets even called foreign interference sometimes, but occasionally I will look at RT, used to be called Russia Today. I will look at other sources for what quotes are in their lead stories as they spin and try to polarize how they present the moment in American politics. And often I would just see a quote, an accurate quote from Donald Trump, from Bill Barr, from somebody high ranking in our government or somebody on the outside close to them. And I don't know if researchers tend to tally that as foreign election interference, an accurate quote of the US president and US attorney general, but it is serving the same function this cycle. And it's probably more effective because it's coming from ultimately a source that's credible with many Americans.
It's very disturbing. I'm wondering too, if leading up to an election, if foreign interference is intent, or any interference, I shouldn't limit this to foreign, I suppose, but if political bad actors are aiming to either influence the outcome of an election or sort of just like sow chaos generally, what has changed now that the election's outcome is clear? Like, is now, obviously we're seeing this very robust effort to delegitimize the election outcomes and to say that there was fraud when there is no evidence of fraud. And to your point, we're seeing that from officials themselves. But do you see that the nature of disinformation attempts, either from inside or outside the US, changes now that the election is officially behind us?
Well, I would say the election results are clear to 65% of the country, and that's the real concern. And I think if you look back at what Russia honestly thought would happen in 2016 and their play there was getting ready for what we're seeing now. I mean, they thought Hillary Clinton would win too. And we saw sprinkled throughout their messaging. I mean, yes, there was an effort to denigrate Hillary Clinton and everything that has been well publicized. But throughout, there was this fraud narrative, which of course Trump was talking about in 2016 too, when we didn't have mail-in ballots and everything else. So I think they were prepping in 2016 for what's happening now. And we've seen that throughout 2020, starting with the Iowa caucuses, when there was that whole fiasco with the app malfunctioning. RT and Sputnik were running nonstop articles about what happened there and about sort of this, political behind the scenes hijinks and all of these efforts to manipulate results that the Democratic Party was polling internally, not even talking about the general election. So I think this has been built into the plan for a very long time. I don't think it's necessarily like now we are transitioning because we seem to have a clear result. So it's a different strategy. That's been a strategy of foreign and domestic. Obviously, Trump has been signaling this for months, but we saw, on election day at 7 a.m. in the morning when polls open in Philadelphia, it took about 10 minutes for the first video to appear in sort of the right-wing ecosystem claiming voter fraud and voter suppression and poll workers not being allowed in. So what we're seeing now, I think we're seeing the plan in action. And I don't think that this is going to wrap up in the next week or two. And I frankly don't even think it's going to wrap up if Trump just decides he's going to concede. I don't really see that happening. But even if, the better angels sort of speak to him and he comes out on Friday and says, does an Al Gore and says, I disagree, but for the betterment of the country. I think it's sort of the horses out of the barn at this point. And I think the damage is going to be long lasting here because those narratives are just, they're really deep rooted at this point, and I don't think you can wind this back up. So I'm very, very concerned for not only how long this lasts and kind of the immediate, but for the long-term damage for every election that we see from here on out. I think this is just going to be a constant going forward.
Well, and there's obviously grave concern for the health of democracy, but then also because of this sort of that people aren't sharing aren't occupying shared sense of reality, the 65% you mentioned, there is this very real concern about how online disinformation spills out into offline life. And even I should say, I think that we overuse still that distinction when it doesn't really exist. But Josh, I'm curious for your thoughts on, I mean, we've been primed to worry about threats of violence related to sort of election chaos. What are you seeing and what are you most concerned about in terms of, you know, the direct line from disinformation to whether it's unlawful militias taking matters into their own hands, that kind of thing?
I'll start with one note of good news before I get gloomy again. But the good news was Election Day itself, which I think passed with limited incidents of armed intimidation, armed voter suppression, nothing I think we'd call coordinated violence. And we're at a point in the United States where we need to stop and appreciate that. It's maybe astonishing that we have to, but it's better in some ways than Election Day was expected to be. And so that's the good news. The bad news is the unlawful private militias across the country, their followers, those who share some ideological similarities, they, after Election Day, continue to consume a limited set of information, but really more disinformation that has led to an increasing insistence that the election results, as most of us, many of us believe them to clearly be, are illegitimate. To the extent they will end up being the results, they think that that's a rigged outcome or a stolen outcome in some way. And one thing I've been seeing in the even just the first week after Election Day is an increasing narrative in the really extreme right circles online that the Republican Party can't be trusted to stand up for Donald Trump. In other words, they're laying the groundwork for saying, look, sure, there's some litigation happening, there's some statements being made in Trump's support, but we don't think the Republican Party is doing everything it can to, in their worldview, salvage this election for Donald Trump, which has begun to lead to the question of, well, what more should we as unlawful armed militias or individuals, what should we do? And if the answer becomes violence, that's a particularly dangerous place for the country to be. But I think it's just notable to see that separation, that wedge being driven in the rhetoric between this individual Donald Trump, who has such an astonishing hold now on so many in this country, and even separating away the party apparatus if it doesn't do what these individuals and groups think it should be doing to press Trump's case.
Well, and it's very much the sort of QAnon contingency, this most deeply pro-Trump, anti-establishment, anti-institution, anti-reality group, I think. We're running out of time, sadly, but I want to hopefully end on a at least constructive note because so much of this is so heavy. And I'm curious just briefly for both of your views on, for people who are wondering what they as individuals can do, whether it's they have family members who are conspiracy theorists or they want to, encourage the health of democracy or put pressure on social platforms to be better, whatever it may be. What do you think the role is of the individual in fighting these many complicated overlapping forces that we're facing with regard to disinformation and extremism?
I mean, this is a little bit lame, but it's something that I kind of promote. It's like to take some responsibility over your own small community. Like individually, even those of us, I mean, it's my job to kind of counter disinformation. But if I look at it as fighting sort of the health of the information ecosystem, like I'm just going to give up and head to the bar kind of thing. Like it's hopeless. But if you're just, an average person out there who just sees like what their feed has become and it is disheartening, to take ownership over your community, whether that's, your online kind of community or your friend group offline, and like do your part in improving kind of the health of discourse there, which is don't be responsible for spreading mis or disinformation, which most people obviously never think that they are doing that, but be careful and cross-check and understand that disinformation targets your biases. So like all of us are quite good at spotting disinformation when it's about the party or a cause that we do not support. We're quite bad when we want it to be true. And so people need a better understanding of that and not to kind of fall in the traps of like doing what the other side is doing. And then when you do have people in your family who are consistently spreading disinformation, like there are ways to engage that don't kind of further inflame tensions. So calling them out openly on social media and calling them an idiot and like getting into this sort of escalating rhetoric and conflict is not obviously helpful. But there are ways of kind of, if you think these people are still salvageable, I mean, some, if they're way off the deep end, it's lost cause, but of directing them to appropriate sources. I mean, I did that with a family member this week who was spreading something about more voters in Wisconsin voting than were actually registered. And I was able to point them to sources saying, look, that was taking data from 7 days before the election. You can register up to the day of the election, just kind of walk people through. So I think shrinking down this huge problem into your own smaller circle and tackling it there, it's just kind of easier to approach it that way, because otherwise it does seem insurmountable.
I don't think that's lame at all. I think it's very good advice. Josh, in our last minute, anything to add?
That is a great set of advice from Brett. And all I will add to it, maybe moving even one step away from the digital platforms themselves, is have awkward political conversations in this country. For a while, we said the opposite because they were so awkward and so uncomfortable that we said giving and not talk about it. But we're at a point where the information silos are so extreme and they're leading to such differing senses of what reality is. We have to do the opposite. We have to have the awkward and the uncomfortable conversations, not just about particular content, though I think that's critical what Brett's emphasizing, but also about basic ideologies and visions of this country and what a participatory democracy should look like.
That's great. So be good to each other in your communities, be a force for good, and learn how to disagree with one another again. I think those are all really important points. Thank you both so much for coming today. And thank you all to those of you who have joined us. And special thanks especially to the Global Security Forum for having us. This has been fascinating, and really appreciate everyone's time.
Well, hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us at the Soufan Center's Global Security Forum. I'm Kevin Barron. I'm your moderator for the next about an hour. I'm the Executive Director of Defense One, a news and ideas website and news brand at covering the Pentagon and national security issues across the spectrum. And I'm pleased to have my first guest today, none other than John Allen, familiar to all of you, I'm sure, president of Brookings Institution, as well as retired general, former NATO ISAF commander in Afghanistan, former global counter-ISIS envoy, former deputy MNF commander in Iraq, and a whole lot of other formers, perhaps. But maybe one day Brookings will be a former. Who knows what's next for John Allen? But we thank him for joining us with a little bit of our late rescheduling. I know a lot of you were looking forward to an interview with Chris Krebs earlier this morning. Obviously, with events going on, that didn't come to fruition. So we wish him well, but we have General Allen now, and then later in the hour, former CIA Director John Brennan joining us to talk about those issues. So I'm actually very excited to talk to you today, John, because a lot has happened on our beat, on your former beat, that I would love, I'm sure a lot of others would love to hear about. And we're going to go through a lot of those issues, the Afghan and Iraq drawdown of troops, the incoming Biden administration, the future of foreign policy in America, and perhaps a bit of a renewal of American leadership as lots of folks see it. So welcome today. And I'll get right to it and say, Afghanistan and Iraq, we heard the announcement from the president. With less than 2 months to go, he wants to draw down to 2,500 troops in each country. So I guess my first question, other than your general reaction, is that, how possible is that in a safe way to draw down to that number? What would we expect a number like that to do if we even know what their mission is? And where should things go once January 20 hits and it's a new commander-in-chief who can give a whole different order?
Well, great questions, Kevin. It's great to be back with you and Defense One, but it's also great to be at the Global Forum, the Soufan Center. Look, I think we're experiencing the difference between what the commander-in-chief can do versus what the commander-in-chief should do. And these decisions are being made truly in the 59th minute to midnight in this administration. The whole issue about whether the election will ultimately result in a new administration, I think that's settled now in everyone's mind except just a few folks. And so the decisions with respect to the force drawdown in Afghanistan and in Iraq, I think first we have to wonder whether that's going to create some kind of instability in the programs that both of our commanders there were leading and shepherding. For example, what does this mean for NATO and our NATO allies? Did we confer with them? And my guess is that we didn't. What does this mean for the large number of American contractors? What does this mean for the NGOs that may find themselves uncovered in the context of the security that within which they've operated in the past? So it isn't just a matter of 2,500 troops coming down. It's a matter of the entire international presence that's there, and have we in Afghanistan destabilized that presence? Have we destabilized the mission? This is ahead of schedule. It appears to be, as was explained, an intent to fulfill a campaign promise from years ago. I think most of us believe at this point that we are so far into this administration, or put differently, we're so little time left in this administration, that we question whether this was to fulfill a campaign promise or to foreclose options of the Biden administration. In Afghanistan, happily, we're at the very end, and maybe at the end of the traditional period of time called the fighting season. And so the period of time of the winter, and it will coincide with the beginning of the Biden administration, will give us some time, some breathing spell to figure out what this precipitous drawdown means, what it means for our NATO allies, what it means for the American contractors that are there, and the international contractors and the NGOs and so on. What does it mean for the Ghani government? And what does it mean for the intra-Afghan negotiations? Now, there has been some progress in those intra-Afghan negotiations, and we've seen that begin to unfold. But look, the Taliban, I think we can say, those of us who know them can say that they're completely unreliable in the end. And the group that we've been dealing with there doesn't speak for all of the Afghan Taliban. And so just the basic requirement by the United States that the Taliban must divorce the Al-Qaeda, that's not coming to fruition. And the American agreement with the Taliban, which theoretically set the conditions for the intra-Afghan negotiations, I think it remains to be determined whether they're going to be true to that and ultimately true to the intra-Afghan negotiations. So much remains to be determined here. And my fear is that we potentially could destabilize both the mission and the talks and ultimately the Afghan government by a precipitous departure.
Bottom line, do you believe that this was a purely political decision or has any merit in ground conditions?
There's no merit to this, none. None. Look, we've got a new administration coming in. I think that administration is going to look at the peace agreement. It's going to look at the progress of the intra-Afghan agreement or the intra-Afghan negotiations that are going forward. And the more of these kinds of consequential decisions that are made late in the Trump administration breaks up the continuity that would normally occur from one administration to another. It forecloses options that the Biden administration might have had or opportunities the Biden administration might have wanted to take. So I believe it's political. It's not, there was no tactical, operational, or strategic merit to doing this with such a short period of time. And in fact, it's not even clear, given the fact that these troops have to be out a week before the inauguration. It's not even clear that the laws of physics will permit that to happen. So, you know, once again, just as we were stampeded out of Syria a couple of years ago by a unilateral decision by the president, we may find ourselves appearing to be stampeded out of Afghanistan. The good news, of course, is we have a great commander there, great leadership there, and they will do their level best to work with our partners, to work with the Afghans, to try to make this as seamless as possible. The question then becomes, what will the Biden administration do in reaction to it? I will simply tell you, it's very difficult once troops come out to put troops back in, and we'll see what that would do if he even contemplated that.
Yeah, the physics of it, I reminded me of the end of Iraq with you know, a different time, a different size or scale of war. But it's not just the people that have to come out. There's a lot of things and intelligence, and enablers, and all. One thing I wanted to follow up on. You mentioned the peace agreement. You know, one of the criticisms is that the United States, their leverage for peace was the presence of U.S. troops, and we weren't supposed to draw down anybody until the Taliban lived up to their end of the bargain. So you agree this doesn't help? No,
it doesn't. Look, the Taliban have been, we've seen this from them forever. They've been waiting for us to depart so that they could take full advantage of the absence of, first, an international presence that could hold them accountable, and second, the potential weaknesses of the Afghan government itself. And, you know, you've heard me, Kevin, you and I haven't talked about this, but I've been quite public about this. One of the areas where I think we really failed in the U.S. Taliban agreement was that we really left the women of Afghanistan exposed here. This may be an issue that ultimately figures prominently in the intra-Afghan conversation, but we know that the Taliban have no specific interests in forwarding the rights of the women in Afghanistan or women in civil society or civil society at all. And we wrote that off in our agreement, and it's not going to play, I think, with any real measure in the intra-Afghan negotiations. And if we are clearly on our way out, the opportunity for that to be leveraged is much less, particularly if we draw the U.S. Embassy down as well. You know, that's a very important mission to us, and the U.S. Embassy and the drawdown of the U.S. forces within the international command really undercuts so much of what's going on in Afghanistan now.
Well, look, last bit on Afghanistan before we move on. You know, there's a lot of reaction to the news that's actually, you know what, it's about time. It's overdue. The wars, these are the, you know, the endless wars theme. You know that theme from the campaign trail. It's popular on the far right and the far left, frankly. And a lot of people that have long experience with this war who have gotten tired of it and don't believe it anymore and want to walk away. So what is your advice to the Biden administration come day one? Should they reverse this move and stick with it, or should they reconsider something else?
Well, first, I'll be very clear that I don't favor forever wars either. I hate that term because, a lot of our troops have given their lives in these forever wars. And you know what? They didn't have any choice in the matter. Those decisions weren't made by the generals. Those decisions were made by political leadership. And so forever wars, when they look at the military and say, you got to get out of those wars, that to me is a cop out from the political responsibilities they had to solve these things. Second thing is, I'm not proposing that we stay in Afghanistan forever. We had an agreement that we entered into that would ultimately reduce our numbers to something very small, if at all. But look, we have to recognize that the Taliban were the platform from which international terrorism struck the United States and others of our partners. And if they are unwilling to divorce themselves from Al-Qaeda, as was part of the stipulation in the US Taliban agreement, then we're going to have to pay close attention to the outcome. So at this juncture, it would appear that even if we executed the Trump era Taliban agreement, our numbers were coming down in any case. So those Americans who want us out, we're coming out. And all of us want to get out of this eventually. But the question is, do we destabilize all that we have sought to put in place? Do we undercut the government of Afghanistan? Do we undercut Afghan women? Do we undercut our capacity to protect ourselves against terrorism if we come out so precipitously that, in fact, it destabilizes the campaign, destabilizes the Afghan government, and just makes it almost impossible for the intra-Afghan talks to go forward, because the international presence in that country, which was really so much of what buttressed the Afghan position, the government of Afghanistan versus the Taliban, it's been undercut and in many respects leaves them vulnerable. So no one's arguing whether we should come out or not. The question is, we agreed to a downward slope with respect to our withdrawal. And if we're hastening that along just to put the Biden administration into a difficult situation and to remain faithful to some kind of a troop withdrawal that could have occurred years ago, but is now occurring literally, as I said, in the 59th minute before midnight in the Trump administration, that's just a political decision, I think, intended to put the Biden administration in an awkward position.
Okay, and so we can slide to the other side of CENTCOM. Iraq was the other part of that announcement. And I'm going to add Syria into it because when it comes to American leadership, probably the bigger criticism has been on the decision, as you mentioned earlier, to pull out from Syria mostly. And we had a little bit of news in the last couple of weeks too of Jim Jeffrey had an exit interview with Defense One, we'll plug ourselves, in which he said that they were playing a shell game. That was his phrase with the president, and hiding the actual number of troops going in and out of the country to keep it at some level above 200. At the same time, in all of these congratulatory messages to President-elect Biden, one of them came from the SDF commander, General Muslim, who said straight up, send troops back. They think they need U.S. troops there. What's the role for American leadership in Syria going forward now, both the ISIS war or the Assad state of Syria's future? And we can blend that into Iraq or talk more about Iraq next.
Well, all along, the intent was that in the aftermath of the, I'll use the word defeat, but it's in quotes, I would say the defeat of the organized tactical units of the Islamic State, the purpose of the American troops in northeast Syria, which was never intended to be a permanent presence there, but the purpose of those troops was to create or to officiate, if you will, in the stabilization necessary to stabilize in the aftermath of the liberation of those populations, all the way from Raqqa down to Deir ez-Zor to the Iraq border. And those weren't many troops, about 2,000 troops or so, and they were really important to the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, in stabilizing that area and trying to bring back some normalcy to life, while the larger issue about the future of Syria was going to be decided. And of course, a phone call from Erdogan, the president the next day announces the American withdrawal, and it really becomes a stampede in many respects. And, we had this horrible image of Syrians throwing rotten vegetables at American troops who had days before worked closely with the SDF, and some of our troops had paid with their lives in service with the SDF to defeat the Islamic State and provide the basis for true stabilization that they hadn't seen in years. And now we're coming out because Erdogan wants to conduct military operations against the YPG. I don't know if we'll go back in. This is a decision clearly that the Biden administration must undertake. My guess will be that there will be probably a pretty thorough global force structure or force presence evaluation as one of the earliest undertakings within the Department of Defense. But we have clear interests in maintaining the stabilization of northeast Syria because of our relationship with Iraq and our relationship with Kurdistan, the PR or the KRG. So we have responsibilities there, and whether we put more troops in or whether we continue a shell game or not under the Biden administration, I think that there has to be a full eyes wide open analysis of what our troop requirements are in northern Syria, in the KRG, in Iraq writ large, in order to keep there being a flashback, if you will, of the Islamic State, and to provide the stabilization necessary for the Iraqi state to get on its feet after now a second major conflict.
Hearing you talk about, just to walk us through Syria, it's familiar to me, it's familiar to you, it's deep, it's complicated, it's not an easy decision. You know what it's not? It's not endless wars. It's not an easy catchphrase for Americans to latch onto and either oppose or support. I wanted to talk with you about the very notion of American desire for leadership abroad in places like Syria, in places like Afghanistan. Feel free to talk more, NATO, China, whatever it is. But the fact is, it's complicated. And some of this, some of these Pew polls and Chicago Council polls, if you ask Americans, should we have troops forward stationed abroad to defend against threats or deter? They say, sure. When you ask them, should we be in Afghanistan or Syria? Well, no. And because the way the evil dollar will put it is if Americans think it's for the United States benefit, they're for it. But if they think troops are just there to help build some other country, that's where they say no, especially if it takes a long time and if deaths and threats occur. So how much does that matter for an incoming administration or to a commander, maybe not to a commander, but to a political leader? How much should it matter what the American people are thinking and feeling right now versus where leaders need to take them or should take them?
Well, an individual like Joe Biden, I think, President-elect and soon to be President Biden, is well known for being able to do both of those things, both to have a full and comprehensive understanding of the security environment in the world at large, our strategic environment in which the United States has to be relevant in the 21st century, but also to be closely attuned to the will of the American people. And as you say, Kevin, very well, the polls would seem to indicate that Americans want to be engaged overseas, but often find fault with engagement in particular locations. And I don't fault the American people for that. What I would say is we the leadership, those who are engaged in having to make these difficult decisions about the deployment of American forces potentially in harm's way, have to do a better job in explaining exactly why we would need to have 2,000 troops in northeast Syria or 2,500 troops remaining in Iraq for some period of time, and explain why that's important. And explain exactly the successes that we've had. Undeniably, there was success under the Trump administration in dealing with the Islamic State. It was largely a follow-through on the work that President Obama and Vice President Biden had undertaken. But that was a success in many respects. But we failed, I think, to capitalize on the ability to explain it to the American people in terms that meant something to them. So when we understand that the American people and the United States is most consequential in the world when we are engaged, those points of engagement need to be explained. And that's what the responsibility of our leadership needs to be. And we've got some areas where there are difficult times ahead. What's going to be our responsibility, or what's going to be our engagement in the war in Yemen? What's going to be our continued engagement in Iraq? Given the intent by the Iranians ultimately to dominate Iraq in so many ways. What's going to be our long-term engagement in northeast Syria and in Afghanistan? and in East Asia in a number of places. We have an obligation to explain these points of engagement as parts of an overall strategy for engagement so that the American people can have confidence that when we spend the treasure, but very importantly, commit the blood of America's daughters and sons overseas, that they have an understanding of why that is important.
I think we're in our last 5 to 10 minutes, and I wanted to ask, one of the areas Americans are being asked to care and be engaged in international security is China. And one of those big issues is 5G. You've done a lot of work on AI and technology as a new frontier. Maybe walk us through a little bit, again, thinking to the future of what we should expect in a new administration, what you'd like to see about how to get Americans involved in that concern in a way that's maybe different than either China's the new public enemy number one, or we don't care about China, when right now we've written a lot about it this year, and it's the NBA doesn't buy into it, and Mark Cuban doesn't necessarily buy into it. Google, Facebook, maybe, you never know, but Secretary Pompeo was out there saying this is a battle for the soul of the world, as he's putting it, for your soul. And it's even if it's just competition, it's that big of a deal. Do you agree with that phrasing, with that level of concern and sincerity? Sure. And do you think the American people are catching on and the world is catching on?
Well, I think, a couple of things. The U.S.-Chinese relationship for America, and I think for China, will be the consequential relationship of the 21st century. I don't think there's any doubt about that. The question becomes, how do we shape that relationship so that it is constructive, so that it is valuable to the United States and more broadly the community of democracies? And this is an area where I think the Biden administration has an opportunity for some great progress. This idea of a summit of democracies to bring together the aggregation of our commitment to human rights and our aggregation to the commitment to democracy, our aggregation to our economic relationships, but very importantly, our commitment to an aggregation of our technological achievements, because so many of the democracies are also quite advanced technologically. And if we're not careful, this strategy of trying to decouple the Chinese from the global economy or from the advances of technology, we got to be very careful about creating an environment where the Chinese are able to undertake a completely indigenous development of its own technologies. And the bifurcation of technology in the 21st century, I think, will be a very dangerous outcome. And technology is going to play very, very importantly. In fact, the advance of technology may well be the platform on which geopolitics will unfold in the years to come, whether it's in the context of supercomputing as quantum computing comes online. The enormity of the capacity of quantum computing has yet to be fully explained to the American people, certainly, and I think more broadly the community of democracies. The enormity of the capacity for artificial intelligence, biotechnology, nanotechnology. These are all technologies that are moving very, very quickly. The Chinese are pursuing their own routes in these. And the thing we can't afford to have happen is for multiple different platforms of technology to occur in the world. Because the idea of authoritative capitalism or authoritarian capitalism, which is the model that the Chinese are proposing, is quite attractive to segments in the world that would be very happy to maintain an illiberal system of government on their own, be supported by the Chinese, and be buoyed on the Chinese system of technology. We've got to be very careful about that. That doesn't mean, though, we can't have constructive relationships with China, because there are some problems that we'll face in this world in the 21st century that can't be solved if the United States and China can't find a cooperative way forward. We're living through one right now, a pandemic, and the global economic downturn that could ultimately create opportunities for China vis-a-vis our partners economically that we would never want to have happen. There are issues associated with climate where we can find the way to cooperate. But we have to recognize that China will be a competitor. But we have to manage that competition so it is not just a strategy of confrontation. I don't know a lot about many things, but I know a lot about the movement from confrontation to conflict. We've got to be very careful that we manage competition to take advantage and to harvest opportunity from it, but not permit competition to ultimately be nothing but perennial confrontation, because the distance from one to the other is a short distance to conflict, and it's quite slippery. So the United States has got to embrace, and I suspect under this administration we will, a commitment to science, a commitment to technology, a commitment to invest in that and to harvest the enormous capabilities of America's technical companies and those of the community of democracies, so that we have a very solid way forward in the 21st century for technology on our terms, not on the Chinese terms.
Well, I think your message is, from what I hear, well received on both sides of the aisle here in Washington and among the national security leadership. Like we said, the question is, will the American people beyond our world pick up on it?
Sure.
It is a new world coming forward. We got a couple months left before we get a new president. John Allen, thank you very much for joining us at the Global Security Forum, especially with the last minute switch pitch hitting assignment that you received. I know you're a busy man, and we greatly appreciate your thoughts. It's always good to talk to you.
Great to see you, Kevin. And my very best wishes ultimately to you and to the Soufan Center, but also to Chris Krebs, who couldn't be here today. I wish him the best for his moral courage in taking the stands he has.
Great. Thank you, sir. Well, hello, I think we're live. I'm not seeing myself yet, but I'm Kevin Barron. I'm the executive director of, I'm the executive editor of Defense One. I'm here to host our last session for the hour with our second substitute panelist, who we're very grateful to have, former CIA Director John Brennan, who knows we were about to, this morning, have a nice conversation with Chris Krebs before the president summarily fired him by tweet last night to talk about election security and the frankly, what seems to be quite successful effort at election security, considering the last time around. And instead, we have a whole political battle going on. So I want to thank the Global Security Forum and the Soufan Center for helping with the last minute switch. And thanks to Director Brennan for joining us. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, Kevin. It's great to be here, and I appreciate the invitation but from the Soufan Center to participate in what is, clearly a very, very important forum and discussion. It's already generated a fair amount of buzz. So thank you so much.
Great, and you're welcome. So let's get right to it. I know you've been out on air talking already, but your initial reaction from the overnight firing of Chris Krebs, seems to be echoes of the final days of Watergate. This scramble to silence any opposition. And oddly, what a lot of the security world is reporting was a success story, that a lot of a great effort under the Trump administration to come together and harden Americans' elections processes and systems. What's your initial reaction to what Trump did to Krebs?
Well, I think no one should be surprised or even shocked at what has happened, because Donald Trump has demonstrated time and again that he's a vindictive person and will take action against those that he believes are disloyal to him personally. And so it's very unfortunate that Chris Krebs, who is very, very qualified and has deep cybersecurity expertise, and who I think did a great job in the run-up to the election and the aftermath of trying to make our systems as impenetrable as possible from intruders, whether they be foreign or domestic intruders. And so I think it really is quite worrisome in terms of this disruption, because although Chris Krebs and his team did a great job, along with FBI and NSA and others, to make this election very secure, the US government's cybersecurity responsibilities continue. And on a daily basis, CISA, the organization that he led, is involved in trying to prevent these cyber attacks against our infrastructure, against our country. And so therefore, I think this summary firing of Chris Krebs, again, is not just score settling on the part of Donald Trump. It also reflects his unwillingness to take into account what is in the best interests of the United States and the American people. And so again, this is very, very troubling, dismaying, but also, again, I think it is very much in keeping with Donald Trump's MO to date.
What do you make of the critics who fire back, and not just Trump himself, but look, this is another example of the deep state. Why should they believe you? Director Brennan, you've been anti-Trump for all these years. You must be a liberal on the left. So it's either a liberal conspiracy or it's a deep state conspiracy. Whatever it is, the intelligence that's come out and these intelligence leaders are not to be trusted.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people are drinking at the fountain of disinformation, whether it's coming out of the Oval Office or whether it's coming out of various news networks that have provided this image of this deep state that is working to undermine Donald Trump. That is not true. I worked in the national security environment for over 30 years, and it consists of some of the most patriotic professionals who are dedicating their lives to keep their fellow citizens safe. And it's quite ironic that when I was in the Obama administration for those entire 8 years, the first 4 working at the White House as President Obama's counterterrorism advisor, and then at the helm of CIA during his second term, I was mostly criticized from the Democrats in Congress, and they were the ones that called for my firing and resignation. And so I think a lot of politicians just take great offense at anything coming out of the intelligence community that is inconsistent with what their worldviews are. And as we have seen time and again, that Donald Trump continues to try to delegitimize any source of criticism or views that are contrary to his own. That's why he's taken aim at the media, because it is, in fact, trying to reveal truths, not only about him, but also what reality is. So again, I think what Donald Trump has tried to do, whether it be with law enforcement, the FBI or CIA or others, is to condemn it whenever they do something that is independent of what his preferences are.
So, well, what is your prescription for the future then? Defensemen always like to push the future. What needs to come next? We know what's going on now, whether it's from Biden or even before Biden comes to office, when it comes to fighting disinformation. What can government do? What can intelligence agencies do?
Well, that's a really good question. I think we've always had to deal with disinformation over the last, since our country was founded. The digital environment, though, has just provided such a larger and even more fertile ground for the propagators of disinformation, specifically using the social media platforms. I think we found out quite a bit from the Mueller investigative team in terms of how the Russians were able to take advantage of that social media environment by pushing out information there under the guise of personas, American personas, that really were, in fact, Russian cyber actors. And so how is our government, how is our society going to deal with ensuring that we continue to honor freedom of speech and those principles that our country was founded upon, privacy and civil liberties, again, in this digital environment, but at the same time, have the government take those actions necessary in order to prevent that environment from being exploited by malactors, whether they be domestic or foreign. And so I do think the challenge for the next decade or two is how our government, how our country is going to come to terms with what should be done in that digital environment. What should the government's role be? What should the FBI and NSA and CIA and Homeland Security be doing in that environment that, again, optimizes its security, its reliability, but at the same time does not compromise privacy, civil liberties, and freedom of speech? I don't know the answer to that, but I'm sure that if we provide some real brain power, against this issue, and that's why for many years I've called for an independent bipartisan commission, like we did in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, and also in the aftermath of the WMD debacle regarding Iraq. Having a commission look at this issue very intensely, and for the digital environment, I think you want to bring in technologists, futurists, government officials, financiers, entrepreneurs, those who really understand that environment and need to continue to benefit from it. But I think right now we still have not taken a strategic approach to what I think is a real security challenge for the future.
Well, that's an interesting list of people that you list off. But to me, what's missing on the list are the partisans, the political leaders. We know what technologists feel somewhat. We know what a lot of the society feels. But a lot of the argument is that it's not the problem. The problem isn't Facebook and Google. The problem are the people that use or abuse Facebook and not Google, Twitter, whatever the social media is. So you have some arguing that you need to just shut down these social media sites altogether, and others saying no, free speech. In fact, we want our own. We want Parler. We want our own space to say whatever we want in the public forum.
And absolutely, you need to have representatives from all different parts of that ideological spectrum, as you pointed out, from the most liberal to the most conservative. And you need to have the partisans involved. And in these past commissions, you did have former politicians and government officials who could bring to bear their perspective in terms of how partisan politics plays into this. But clearly, we need to look at this not just through the prism of partisan politics. We need to look at it from the standpoint of what we need to do, again, as a country, as an international community, to try to better secure that environment so that it's not going to be basically the environment for our demise. Because our prosperity, our security really rests on that, the integrity of that environment. So partisan politics, unfortunately, has played too much of a role. And I have been appalled at how partisan politicians have really set aside what they know are the best interests of the country, because they're trying to advance their own personal political interests, or in the most recent examples, them trying to rationalize, apologize, or ignore the whims of Donald Trump.
Where do you see hope for the future in the sense? I'm reminded that Microsoft's president, whose name escapes me frequently in his speeches, talks about the idea of needing a cyber like rules of the road, right? An agreement, some sort of peace treaty among among nations and among companies of this is this is what's acceptable behavior and this is what's not acceptable behavior when it comes to cybersecurity and espionage and crime. And this came up too in a panel I was at the Shangri-La conference in Singapore with General Nakasone, the cyber commander, and a representative from the Chinese government. And a similar suggestion was made that countries also need to have a new awareness of this era we're in and have an agreement and even show each other a little bit of what their offensive capabilities are, just like nuclear powers do with their nuclear arsenals. And I remember General Nakasone to that saying, sure, you first, show us what you have. So a non-governmental, bigger whole society way forward. You have hope that that's possible, or is it that it has to happen?
I think some elements of it have to happen. That digital environment in the United States is owned and operated 85% by the private sector. It's not an environment that the government controls, nor even can it. And so I do believe that there needs to be an unprecedented partnership between the public sector, the private sector, and even the not-for-profit sector. I think the academic world and the think tank world really needs to participate in this as well. And I believe that as a result of what we have experienced over the last couple of decades, as technology really has transformed our daily lives. When I started in government in 1980, we didn't even have a personal computer on our desk. And it really has been transformational, revolutionary what has happened. I think more people now today are much more familiar with that digital environment and technology. People are growing up in that environment. But if you listen to some of the congressional committee hearings and you see people who are older than me who have very little understanding of the cyber environment or technology, some of those hearings are quite frankly embarrassing. And so I do think that there needs to be a renewed effort, again, bringing together the different stakeholders from all different parts of the political spectrum, from the technical spectrum, to really think through how we're going to do this in a manner that really makes sense. But as you point out, it's not just a sovereign country issue because the digital environment does not always respect those sovereign borders. And so, but I think if we start in the United States working with some of our key partners and allies, and then try to expand it and have a little bit more transparency into capabilities as well as the rules of the road, as you point out, I think it's important to start to go down that path. But I think so far we've been doing things in a very ad hoc fashion, and hopefully we're not going to have to experience a 9/11 in order to get to that point.
Yeah, convincing allies, convincing the public. That's a common theme that we hear. While you're talking, it made me think I wanted to ask you, what can you tell us about how partner allies, countries, intelligence services, what they're feeling or thinking about the coming out of the Trump administration now, moving to Biden, what their concerns may be? Because the public news stories that come to mind for me are 5G, China trying to convince other allies to a threat that the U.S. sees that's more, or Afghanistan and Iraq, and we'll talk about those cuts next. The effect of these very sporadic and sudden troop withdrawals. What's the sense of the international IC about the end of the Trump administration?
Well, I think, and it's not just the international IC or our allies and partners, it's those governments and those even politicians who I think now will see the United States reclaiming, I think, its rightful role in the international arena. During the last 4 years, we've seen the Trump administration withdraw from multilateral organizations, not pay them the attention I think they need, pulling out of international agreements, the Paris Climate Accords, the Iran nuclear agreement. And so I think that void that has been created is filled then by the Chinese and the Russians who take advantage of that. So, and I think a lot of our former partners and allies really were unnerved because they didn't know if they could count on the United States for, to rebuff these efforts on the part of the Russians, Chinese, and others. This decision to withdraw from Afghanistan or to reduce the number of troops in Afghanistan reportedly was conducted without consultation with those allies and partners who actually have troops in Afghanistan. So I think there's going to be a welcome sigh of relief in a lot of these foreign capitals that we traditionally have worked with on the military, political, and economic front, that the United States is going to return to the traditional role it played in the 75 years after World War II, which was really to be the leading spokesperson for the Western democracies and really try to marshal the type of support necessary in order to make progress against some of these very difficult challenges. The Biden administration, I think, is going to really reflect the view within the Obama administration, which was that the United States, as strong as it is on the military, political, and economic fronts, it derives a lot of its strengths by its bilateral and multilateral engagements. And so by having a greater array of support and allies on various issues, it really does strengthen the United States' voice vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis Russia on so many of these issues. So I think the Biden team is going to work hard in this first year to repair some of these relationships that really have atrophied, either by neglect or by intention. And so I do think that there is right now, certainly among, I think, my former foreign intelligence counterparts, a sense that the engagement of the United States is going to be much more robust, much more extensive, and also, I think, as a result, much more productive.
Yeah, deeper benches. Maybe turn that same question internally. How much of a change or a catch up is needed internally? You know, I saw a couple weeks ago, Secretary, Bob Gates is out there repeating what he's written about and said that the U.S. is at a moment that we need an entirely new relook or reorganization of the national security structure in this country, and which also, in my mind, portends to how do you get American people to get involved, to become part of the national security structure, to want to come into the deep state, into the intelligence community, the State Department, the Pentagon, and help with this renewal or regeneration that folks like yourself are predicting or wanting.
Well, the national security structure, the broad structure, is really the result of 240 years or so of various developments, various startups and departmental initiatives. And so now we are, in fact, the legacy system which is in place. And as I mentioned, just over the past 40 years, as a result of technology, it really has had a transformative impact on how national security is done, as well as that national security ecosystem in terms of global activities and what is out there. And so I agree with Bob Gates that there needs to be a fresh look at whether or not the United States government is organized in a manner that is poised to deal with the challenges of the future as opposed to the past. When I was director of CIA, I reorganized the agency to make it much more agile, much more integrated, so that it could deal with the challenges of the future. And I think there's going to be a lot of oxes that are gored in that process. The Office of Director of National Intelligence, which was created by legislative action in 2004, that's 16 years. A lot has happened in the world. We've learned a lot.
It's hated and rejected.
Yeah, should it be modified? Should it be refined? Should changes take place? But the changes internally in departments or agencies, I think, are insufficient. You need to look at the overall orchestration of the U.S. government's national security apparatus. That is a monumental challenge. It's not something that's going to happen in 1 year or even a single presidential term. And unfortunately, with the dysfunction of Congress and the hyper-partisan environment in Washington right now, some of these real strategic challenges are being neglected as they engage in these petty turf battles that really are, I think, just allowing these problems to fester over time.
So we're under 10 minutes, and as I said earlier, I want to get your thoughts on Afghanistan and Iraq. We heard yesterday, I think it just was like I'm losing track of time and pandemic. We just heard the drawdown. Pentagon is going to carry out the president's order to try to draw down to 2,500 troops in Afghanistan, 2,500 in Iraq by January 15th, just in time for Biden's inauguration. And we just spoke with John Allen. I don't know if you got any of that, but he's none too pleased with the idea, as it seems a whole lot of national security folks are. But on the other hand, there are a lot of people that said this is long overdue and it should have been done a long time ago. These wars are over. The endless war theme that pervaded through the elections. So what is your initial reaction to both the drawdown and your thoughts on what can or should be done about it on January 20th?
Well, I think there are so many unanswered questions because all we have is a date and a number. And so what does that really mean as far as the impact on mission? The retrograde of U.S. forces, which, as you point out, is the drawing down of deployed forces, needs to be done very carefully, very safely, and securely. And I'm sure that General Milley and U.S. military will do their absolute best to ensure that this drawdown to the 2,500 troop level in both countries will be done as best as possible. It shouldn't be accelerated beyond what is best from a safety and security standpoint. But my question is, when you draw down to 2,500 troops, how many of those troops are actually going to be engaged in worthwhile missions? Because a large proportion of them are going to be involved in physical security for the troops. It's going to be involved in logistics, in supplies, in transportation, in communication, in medical care. And so out of that 2,500, how many are going to be involved in counterterrorism work or in providing training and assistance to Afghan and Iraqi forces? So, as well as intelligence collection, because as we know, for many, many years, we have been very concerned that terrorist groups will try to regenerate in areas of Afghanistan. And so that intelligence presence in Afghanistan and Iraq really does rely also heavily on U.S. military support from the standpoint of, again, maybe evacuation if a base is being overrun, or medical support or assistance. So again, I would have to, and this is what we did in the Obama administration when we looked at those drawdowns, how many troops are going to be dedicated to the support functions that are absolutely essential, and how many of them are really going to be able to continue to carry out those missions that our troops were initially sent there to carry out. Should those missions be modified? Should they be reduced or limited? So again, I'm hoping that the committees in Congress are going to be asking some really tough questions of the Pentagon and the White House of, okay, when you get to the 2,500 level, what actually is going to be done that is going to be in the advancement or interests of U.S. national security interests, and what is merely going to be continued support systems?
Well, how does this change or decrease intelligence capabilities? You mentioned that earlier, and especially in Afghanistan more than Iraq, which is more remote. You can't pop in and out of from Kuwait nearby.
Again, I would have to see how these troops are going to be arrayed and aligned, because the forward operating bases in Afghanistan, which are the bases in different parts of the country that continue their technical collection capabilities as well as interacting with locals, whatever else, that really requires military support, because these are enclaves that need to be protected. There need to be security perimeters set up. And so I don't know whether or not there's going to be a sharp reduction in that intelligence capability as a result of this retrograde. So again, there are just too many questions right now that have not been addressed in order to be able to give an evaluation of just how reckless or not this is.
Do you think that there's conditions on the ground to justify the order, or that it's purely political?
Well, I think there are absolutely missions that need to continue in the area. As you point out, intelligence collection inside of Afghanistan, there's still a lot of areas of Afghanistan where a variety of terrorist organizations, including Al-Qaeda, continue to be able to maintain contacts, and I think are trying to reemerge. And with various technical as well as human collection systems and capabilities, we're able to monitor that as well as to take action against it, as well as to make sure that the Afghan security, intelligence, and military forces have the capabilities as well as the intelligence to carry out the counterterrorism operations as necessary. It really affects our security here at home because, again, this Afghan-Pak border area is just so fertile from the standpoint of being able to sow those seeds of terrorist activities that clearly, have hurt us badly in the past.
One of the most recent, the next bit of news that came out of acting SecDef Miller's office was just this morning. I don't know if you saw this, that he flew to Fort Bragg, his first trip out of Washington, and immediately announced that he was going to do what was already in law, which was make the Assistant Secretary of Defense for SOLIC, Special Ops and Low Intensity Conflict, commensurate, almost a service secretary, right? This was something that was in the NDAA a few years back and kind of has been languishing for a few years. But the notion that special operations forces were once, such a primary, face of these wars for what they did, and now we're past that. And they never really reached the level when there was talk of, SOCOM should be a level of a joint chief, or the special operators should be as elevated to the level of Army, Navy, the way that the National Guard found itself a seat on the Joint Chiefs. The whole point of that is right when the president has decided to almost completely withdraw from Iraq and Afghanistan, two of the biggest examples of counterterrorism in the world, his new appointee at the Pentagon has gone to elevate the counterterrorism profile or the special ops profile. Where do you see the future, if you think about this at all, of where special operations and all the lessons of the last wars can fit into this future that's supposed to be about great power competition and China and Russia and nuclear and cyber and space, not trigger pullers on the ground in the dust?
Well, Chris Miller, I think, has served his country ably in uniform for many years, and then also has been involved in, as you point out, SOLIC, Special Operations Low Intensity Conflict. He was in that role in the Pentagon before he went to the National Counterterrorism Center. His perspective, I think, is very much through the prism of counterterrorism operations and special forces. And so, despite his, I think, admirable past service, he is very, I think, inexperienced and unqualified to serve as acting Secretary of Defense. It's clear. And so this action going down to Fort Bragg, I think, is in keeping with his prism. But I do think that there needs to be a much more strategic and systemic look at how these different pieces of the U.S. military fit together. And just, a quick elevation of one, it might be, cathartic for some folks, but I don't think it's been done with any real forethought, at least prior to this decision being made today, if it was announced. It could be something that is worthwhile to consider. I think special forces are going to, be in increasing demand over time. But as you point out, there are other challenges and issues that need to be addressed. And so I would say that I'd like to have the Biden administration take a more holistic look at how the various pieces of the U.S. military fit together and whether or not any additional modifications should be made there. But it should be after some careful study is done so you understand what the implications are of such moves.
Yeah. You and General Allen alike have both mentioned that. I think we can expect a full review come January of everything, force laydown, COCOMs, the way the war is. We're in our last minute, so I wanted to thank you for joining us for your thoughts on all those issues, and also to be sure to plug your memoir, Undaunted. It's out now?
Yes, it is out now. It's called Undaunted, My Fight Against America's Enemies at Home and Abroad. And I tried to give a perspective of 33 plus years in government, all the different things that I was able to witness as part of history, working at the White House, working at CIA, working overseas in Saudi Arabia for 5 years. And it was an interesting journey to recount those experiences. So thanks so much. I appreciate it, Kevin.
You bet. And thank you for joining us at Soufan Center. We know, those of you who pay attention, John Brennan is out there quite often. He's been one of the more vocal national security leaders in the country during this Trump administration. And I'm sure we'll hear a lot more as the transition continues to the next president. Thank you, sir, for joining us. And thanks again to the Soufan Center and to all of you watching at home or wherever you are during this session.
Thank you, Kevin.
Good afternoon. My name is Emerita Torres, and I'm a senior fellow at the Soufan Center and part of the team that organized the Soufan Center's 2020 Global Security Forum, along with our dedicated partners. We just concluded day 3 of the forum, a full day of high-level discussions that explored the impact of disinformation in the evolving nature of the global information environment, as well as the role of U.S. leadership around the world as we transition to a new administration. We kicked things off this morning with a TED-style talk on disinformation in the Middle East, presented by Dr. Mark Owen Jones, Professor of Middle East Studies at Hamad bin Khalifa University in Doha. Mark discussed how the Middle East has become an exporter of disinformation to global audiences. Mark noted from his research that disinformation campaigns in Arabic tend to thrive with respect to their online proliferation and sophistication, due to the lack of regulation of social media companies and the fact that the sector is not inclined to take action on accounts that are perceived to not have an impact on U.S. interests. His remarks also highlighted the growing danger from authoritarian regimes in the region and how they use disinformation as a weapon for harassment and for hate. We then heard a dynamic discussion with Congressman Max Rose of New York's 11th District and Nick Rasmussen, Executive Director of the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, or GIFCT, on the role of the public and private sector in addressing online extremism. The dynamic conversation explored the blind spots that exist among the vast surface area of the online extremism problem, including a lack of effective regulation and accountability of social media companies. They also discussed the importance of the US government and international entities like the GIFCT to see the extremism challenge as a collective action problem, one where we could apply the same types of comprehensive frameworks of global finance, trade, and human rights regulations to online extremism content and hate speech. Next, we heard a fascinating panel focused on conspiracy theories and extremism with Brett Schaefer, Media and Disinformation Fellow with the Alliance for Securing Democracy, Joshua Geltzer, former U.S. National Security Senior Director for Counterterrorism, and Adrienne LaFrance, Executive Editor of The Atlantic. The panelists reflected on how the breadth and depth of disinformation differed in 2016 compared to 2020, when the world witnessed one of the biggest disinformation events in the history of social media, the 2020 US presidential election. No one expected the biggest source of disinformation to be coming from within, specifically the leader of the free world. Experts discussed the robust effort of bad actors to delegitimize the election results, and how the lack of a shared sense of reality combined with increasing extreme narratives online, from QAnon to the extreme right, allows for disinformation on the internet to spill into real life. Looking ahead, the panel emphasized that the source of solutions should not solely be from social media companies themselves. They also emphasized how important it is to follow the money and the critical role individual responsibility plays in countering the spread of online disinformation. Next, we heard a dynamic discussion between Kevin Barron, Executive Editor of Defense One, and General John Allen, President of the Brookings Institution and retired U.S. Marine Corps 4-star general. They explored U.S. leadership in major conflicts and issues the Biden administration will have to tackle, including U.S. engagement in Afghanistan, Syria, and Iraq, and our relationship with China. The late political decisions of the Trump administration, from withdrawing troops in Afghanistan and Syria to our role in Iraq, are likely to be top of mind to address for President Biden. President Trump's 2,500 troop decrease in Afghanistan, for example, has huge potential to cause instability, including for NATO allies, the Afghan government, ongoing intra-Afghan negotiations, counterterrorism efforts, and the people of Afghanistan. On Syria, Commander Allen underscored the need to maintain stability in Northeast Syria in particular, and the Biden administration should come in eyes wide open to consider what our presence and role should be in these ongoing challenges. The discussion ended with Commander Brennan underscoring that China will be the consequential relationship of our time. It must be constructive for the United States and the communities of democracies, and there lies an opportunity for the Biden administration to get China to commit to our terms of technology, as well as our economic, political, and human rights interests. To close out the day, Kevin Barron hosted a fascinating discussion with former CIA Director John Brennan on the role of election meddling and foreign interference, as well as U.S. leadership. Director Brennan debunked the deep state myth and said the summary firing of Chris Krebs, a critical DHS, Department of Homeland Security official tasked with safeguarding our elections and preventing cyber attacks against our country, reflect Trump's unwillingness to take into account what is best for the United States and the American people. Director Brennan noted that the challenge for the next decade will be determining what the government's role should be in the digital environment and how it will take a strategic approach to determining its security while protecting fundamental freedoms. Following the transition to a Biden administration, Director Brennan expects a sigh of relief coming out of countries around the world, as there is an expectation that the administration will regenerate and renew bilateral and multilateral agreements, including the Paris Climate Accord, and repair historically important relationships that have since been neglected. What an insightful day. We hope you will join us tomorrow for day 4, the final day of the forum, where we will explore the role of popular culture and documentary filmmaking in communicating some of these global challenges that we've discussed throughout the week. We're excited to present a fireside chat tomorrow at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time with Alex Gibney, award-winning director, and Lawrence Wright, staff writer for The New Yorker, where they will discuss a wide range of issues, including COVID-19, the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, and foreign election meddling. Thank you so much again for joining us, and we'll see you tomorrow.